Victor Harrow dropped the contract onto the table like it was already settled. "Sign it," he said, "or I'll make sure every bank in the territory knows Blackwell Ranch is a bad investment." He didn't raise his voice. Men like Harrow never needed to. He stood in the middle of the nicest saloon in Red Willow, wool coat pressed clean, silver watch chain catching the lamplight, and he looked at Gideon Blackwell the way a man looks at something he's already bought and paid for. 3 other ranchers sat around that table. 2 of them had already signed. Third was reaching for the pen, and not one of them had read past the first page. If this is your first time finding this channel, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you've been here before, you already know. We don't do short. We don't do simple. We do the kind of story that keeps you up past midnight wondering how it ends. Like this one right here. Stay with me. Gideon Blackwell was not a man who talked much about what he'd lost. He was 41 years old in the autumn of 1886, with the kind of face that had started out handsome and gotten weathered into something more interesting: heavy brow, jaw like a fence post, hands that had fixed fence lines and pulled calves, and signed enough banknotes to give a lesser man nightmares. He owned 6,800 acres outside Red Willow, Montana, which was the kind of number that made other men straighten their spines when they shook his hand. He also owned a house with 14 rooms, most of which he hadn't entered in 3 years. His mother had died in the front parlor on a Wednesday in March, 7 years back. After that, Gideon had quietly shut the doors to rooms she used to occupy and told himself he'd get around to sorting through her things eventually. Eventually had not yet arrived. The curtains in the east wing had faded to the color of old bone. Kitchen garden she'd kept so carefully had gone to weeds. The big stone fireplace in the main room collected dust because Gideon couldn't see the point of a fire when there was no one to sit near it. He ate most nights standing at the kitchen counter, working through whatever his housekeeper, Mrs. Polly, had left covered on the stove. Mrs. Polly was 63, half deaf, and had worked for Gideon's family since before he was born, which meant she was loyal and irreplaceable and physically incapable of managing a large dinner service. She'd told him that plainly back in September. "I can do breakfast and supper for your men," she'd said, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "But if you're feeding a dozen cattle investors in November, you need real help, Gideon." He'd told her he'd figure it out. He did not figure it out. The letter arrived from the investment group on the 14th of October. 8 men traveling from Helena, due to arrive November 3rd. They expected dinner. They were prepared to discuss terms on a cattle contract worth more money than Gideon liked to think about. And they were also the kind of men who noticed details, who noticed, specifically, whether the man they were investing in could manage his own household. Gideon spent 2 weeks pretending this wasn't a problem. Then he told his foreman, Dale Cutter, to find him a cook. Dale was a short, compact man with a red beard and the particular expression of someone who had heard a great many bad ideas in his life and was looking at another one right now. He'd worked for Gideon for 11 years and had long since given up softening his opinions. "For one night," Dale said. For one night, Gideon confirmed. "You want somebody to come in, cook a full dinner for 8 men they've never met, in a kitchen they've never used, supplies they didn't choose." "That's correct." Dale looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said, in the tone of a man who would do the thing and reserve his judgment for later. "I'll ask around." He came back 4 days later with a name. Mara Ellison. She'd arrived in Red Willow 6 weeks earlier from somewhere in Colorado, traveling alone with 2 bags in a manner that Dale described, carefully, as not particularly interested in what anybody else thought. She'd done 1 week of cooking at the Lander boarding house before the owner let her go. Dale said the reason depended on who you asked. The owner claimed she was difficult. 3 of the boarders said the food was the best they'd eaten in 2 years, and they couldn't understand why she'd been dismissed. She was 30 years old. She was unmarried. She was, Dale said, pausing slightly before continuing, a large woman. Heavy through the shoulders and hips, he said. Some people in town had made remarks. "Does she cook?" Gideon asked. "Sounds like she does." "Then get her." Dale brought her out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before the investors were due. Gideon was in the yard when the wagon came in, and he watched her climb down from the seat, and Dale was right. She was a large woman, full-figured, broad-shouldered, with dark hair pinned up under a plain hat and a gray dress that had been mended at least twice. She moved without hesitation. She didn't look around at the yard the way most people did when they came to Blackwell Ranch for the first time. That slow sweep that took in the size of the place. She just looked directly at Gideon. He noticed her eyes first. Brown, steady, and carrying the particular quality of someone who had spent years watching people decide what to think of her before she'd said a word, and who had made their peace with it. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. "Miss Ellison, I'll need to see the kitchen before I agree to anything." He hadn't expected that. Most people arriving for a job at Blackwell Ranch did not open with conditions. He studied her for a moment and decided he didn't particularly mind. "This way," he said. The kitchen was in rough shape and he knew it. Mrs. Polly kept it clean. But the range needed a new firebox brick on the left side. 3 of the cast iron pans had developed wobbles that made them useless for even cooking. The larder was stocked for daily meals and nothing more, and the long work table in the center of the room had a crack running through it that nobody had gotten around to repairing. Mara walked through the space slowly, opening the larder door, checking the range, lifting one of the pans and setting it down again. She didn't say anything for a full 2 minutes. Then she turned around. "You don't need a cook for one night, Mr. Blackwell," she said. "You need somebody willing to tell you this house is dying around you." Gideon looked at her. He couldn't tell if he was annoyed or if she was just right. "The firebox brick," he said. "That's the least of it." She wasn't unkind when she said it. She was just saying what she saw. "That range runs hot on the right and cold on the left, which means anything I put in the oven needs to be rotated every 15 minutes, or it cooks uneven. Can work with that. The pans, 2 of those are done. You should pull them before someone gets hurt. The larder needs another full supply run, and that table needs to be fixed before I put any serious weight on it. I can have the table looked at. Today," she said. "Not tomorrow." He looked at her again. She met his eyes without flinching. "Today," he agreed. He found himself outside 20 minutes later with an axe in his hands, splitting wood for the stove, which was not something he'd done himself in years. He wasn't entirely sure why he was doing it now. Something about the way she'd walked into that kitchen and talked about it like it was a problem she intended to solve, rather than someone else's mess she'd agreed to tolerate. He could hear her moving around in there, opening cabinets, pulling things out. Making a list, he guessed. She appeared in the doorway. "Do you have any rosemary? I don't know." She stared at him. "It's your kitchen. Mrs. Polly handles the garden." "Mrs. Polly let the kitchen garden go to weeds before first frost," Mara said. "I walked past it on the way in. There's nothing left worth harvesting." She paused. "Do you have a supply list from town? I'll need to add things. Tell Dale what you need." "I'm telling you." He stopped splitting wood and looked up. She was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, waiting. There was nothing aggressive about it. She was just present, entirely there, in a way that made it hard to look away. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The supply run took most of the afternoon. Dale drove into Red Willow with Mara's list, and when he came back, the wagon was loaded deeper than Gideon had expected. She'd asked for things he didn't recognize: specific cuts, specific spices, dried herbs, 2 kinds of flour. Dale mentioned, quietly, that some of the men at the feed store had made comments when they saw the list. Said the cook must think she was feeding a president. Dale had not found this funny. Gideon was in his office when Mara started cooking that evening. He could smell it from where he was sitting, which was unusual because his office was on the other side of the house, and he generally couldn't smell anything from the kitchen at all. Whatever she was doing with that beef, it was reaching through the walls. He heard, an hour later, the sound of his ranch hands gathering. That was unusual too. Normally the men ate in the bunkhouse. They came to the main kitchen for breakfast, collected their plates, and took them back. They didn't linger. There was nothing to linger for. But he could hear them now, through the floor voices. Specifically, which was the sound of conversation, which was the sound of people choosing to be somewhere instead of someplace else. Put down his pen and went downstairs. The kitchen was the fullest he'd ever seen it. 6 of his ranch hands were seated at the table, which had been repaired. He noticed somebody had wedged a new piece of wood beneath the crack and planed it smooth. Mara was at the range with her back to the room, stirring something in the good pot, and she was talking without turning around. "You're telling me he rode the fence line in that weather," she was saying. "Twice," said one of the younger hands, a boy named Cord, who was 19 and generally too shy to speak above a mumble. He was not speaking above a mumble now, but he was speaking, which was notable. Came back with ice in his beard and didn't say a word about it. "That's not toughness," Mara said. "That's stubbornness. There's a difference." Laughter. Gideon stood in the doorway and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. When dinner was served the following night, the 8 cattlemen ate for 2 hours and left satisfied. The beef had been roasted with rosemary and black pepper, and something else Gideon couldn't identify. The biscuits were the kind that split open in your hands and steamed. The apple cobbler was served warm, and it was, without question, the best thing Gideon had eaten in years. That wasn't what stayed with him. What stayed with him was that his men had laughed. He'd heard it the night before, and he'd heard it again tonight around the supper table, and he realized, standing there listening, that he could not remember the last time this house had sounded like that. The investors were still shaking hands in the entry hall when he went looking for Mara. He found her in the kitchen, already washing the last of the pans. "You're cleaning up," he said. "Job's not done until it's done." He stood in the doorway. She kept washing. The lamp on the wall made the room warm and yellow, and the house around them was still carrying the sounds of voices, even with the guests heading for their coats. "Mrs. Polly manages 2 meals a day," he said. "She can't handle the household accounts anymore either. I've been doing them myself for 6 months." Mara set down the pan and turned around. "That's not an offer yet. It's going to be." She dried her hands on a cloth and looked at him steadily. She didn't smile. She was taking him seriously, he understood, which meant she was considering it seriously. "1 month," she said. "I'll try 1 month. If you make a remark about my weight, my appetite, or the way I look in the next 30 days, the arrangement ends that day." He didn't hesitate. "Agreed. And I need access to the household accounts from the start. All of them." "All of them," he confirmed. She nodded once. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Blackwell." He extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm. She held it exactly as long as the situation required and not a second more. He went back to his office and sat down at his desk, and he noticed that the house still didn't feel empty. It was a strange thing to notice. By the end of the first week, Gideon understood that he had not hired a cook. He had hired someone who happened to cook, among other things. The kitchen garden was her first project. She went out there the morning after she arrived and spent 2 hours on her knees in the cold, pulling dead growth and turning soil, and came inside and told Dale she needed 6 specific seedlings from the hardware store and 2 bags of manure, and she needed them by Thursday. "It's November," Dale said. "I know what month it is," she said. "Some things winter over fine if you get them in before the hard freeze. Do you want a kitchen garden in the spring or not?" Dale looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at his coffee. "Get her the seedlings," he said. The chicken coop was her second project. It was a disaster: 3 broken boards, a gap in the roof that the wind had been finding all autumn, and a nesting system that made it harder to collect eggs than it should have been. She fixed the boards herself, borrowing tools from the barn without asking, and had Cord patch the roof gap on a Sunday afternoon because she'd noticed he was good with his hands and needed something to do with them. "He's been idle," she told Gideon, matter of fact, when he asked why she'd recruited one of his ranch hands for a chicken coop. Idle young men get into trouble or they get sad. Either way, it's a problem. The household accounts took her 4 days to sort through. She didn't say anything about them to Gideon while she was working, just spread the ledgers across the kitchen table after supper each night and went through them methodically, making notes in the margins in a handwriting that was precise and unexpectedly small given the size of her hands. On the 5th day, she came to find him in the barn. "You're overpaying for feed," she said. He looked up from the harness he was mending. "What?" "The price you're paying per hundredweight, it's $2 over current market rate. Has been for at least 14 months. Either your supplier raised the price and didn't tell you, or someone along the line is pocketing the difference." Gideon set down the harness. "Show me." She showed him. She'd pulled 3 months of receipts and laid them against the listed market prices she'd found in a copy of the Territorial Farm Gazette from the supply store, and the numbers were plain as daylight. He stood over the kitchen table, looking at what she'd done, and felt a particular kind of frustration, not at her, but at himself, for not catching it. "I've been managing this myself for 6 months," he said. I know, she didn't pile on. You're running a ranch. Can't watch everything at once. A pause. You should have a separate person handling the accounts. Someone whose only job is to watch the numbers. I'm looking at her. Mara was quiet for a moment. I agreed to 1 month. I know what you agreed to. She picked up the receipts and stacked them neatly. I'll keep track of the accounts while I'm here, she said. We can talk about the rest later. She was crossing the yard 3 days later when she stopped and stood very still in the middle of the path. He saw her from the barn door. She was looking at Juniper, his best mare, a gray quarter horse he'd owned for 6s. Juniper was moving across the small paddock toward the water trough, and Mara was watching her the way a person watches something that isn't quite right. He walked over. What is it? Her left rear leg, Mara said. She's loading it differently. Not much. But watch her when she turns. He watched. Juniper turned toward the trough, and he saw at a slight hesitation, a fractional weight shift that he'd been chalking up to the cold ground. How long have you noticed that? He asked. Just now, Mara said. But it didn't start just now. That's a compensation movement. She's been favoring something for at least a week, maybe 2. He went into the paddock and picked up Juniper's left rear hoof. Packed deep in the frog was a small stone, angled in just wrong enough to create pressure without being immediately obvious. He got it out in 2 minutes with a pick. Juniper stood quieter immediately, came back to the fence and looked at Mara, who was watching the horse settle. You've worked with horses before, he said. My father had horses, she said, and I pay attention. That was all she said about it. But that evening at supper, when the ranch hands were gathered around the big kitchen table, they'd started doing that, just gradually. The way water finds a low place, Gideon noticed something. Cord was telling a story about a bad throw of a lasso, and Mara was at the range and she was listening, and the boy was talking louder than usual because he knew someone was listening. And there was something in the room that Gideon realized he'd stopped expecting to find in his own house. He'd stopped expecting it so long ago he'd forgotten what to call it. Just life. The ordinary sounds and warmth of people being in a place together. He ate his supper and said very little, and thought about that for a long time afterward. The 3rd week of November brought cold that came hard off the mountains and pinned itself over the valley like something that intended to stay. The men worked shorter days and came in stiffer. Mrs. Polly's knees were giving her trouble, and she'd taken to moving slowly between rooms, and Mara had quietly rearranged things so the older woman didn't have to cross the yard in the cold to get to the supply shed. Gideon noticed that. He didn't say anything about it. He was beginning to notice a great many things about Mara Ellison and saying nothing about most of them. He noticed that she ate her meals standing at the counter sometimes, not because there wasn't room at the table, but because she'd spent enough time in places where she felt watched while eating that she'd built the habit of turning away. He didn't draw attention to it. He just, one morning, sat down at the counter himself instead of at the table, and poured coffee and pushed the second cup toward her without a word. She'd looked at him. He'd looked at his coffee. After a moment, she'd sat down on the stool beside him, and they'd eaten breakfast at the counter together, and neither of them said anything important about it. He noticed the way she moved through a room not apologetically, the way some heavy women did, as though asking permission to take up space, but deliberately. She was aware of her size the way a person is aware of being tall, which is to say she'd simply incorporated it into how she existed in the world. She didn't bump into things. She didn't knock things over. She moved with a precision that came from years of navigating spaces that were not designed with her in mind. He noticed that she read. Every evening after the kitchen was clean, she sat at the end of the work table with a book or a stack of papers, and she read with the same focused attention she gave to everything. He'd glanced at the papers, once land deeds, something territorial. He hadn't asked. He was thinking about asking. The event that changed the direction of November came on a Thursday, when a wagon rolled into the yard carrying a man named Victor Harrow. Gideon knew Harrow by reputation. He was based out of Helena, connected to one of the larger territorial land investment groups, and he moved through the valley periodically with proposals that were, by all accounts, profitable and straightforward. He was the kind of man who dressed like he was always in a meeting, good coat, clean boots, a manner that communicated that his time was worth more than yours, but that he was gracious enough not to say so. He shook Gideon's hand in the yard and said he had something he'd like to discuss that would be mutually beneficial, and Gideon brought him inside. Mara was in the kitchen. Harrow glanced at her when they passed the doorway and looked away without registering her, the way people looked at furniture. They sat in the study, and Harrow laid the contract on the desk. Silver Fork Creek, Harrow said, the Eastern Run. You've got senior water rights through the original territorial grant, which makes Blalach Ranch the linchpin of a larger agreement I'm putting together with 4 other valley properties. What I'm proposing is a consolidated water management arrangement. You agree to participate in a cooperative access structure. I bring in development capital, and everyone in the agreement benefits from the infrastructure improvements. He talked for 20 minutes. The numbers were real. The projected returns were solid. Gideon had seen enough deals to know when one was constructed carefully that it looked better than it was, but this one looked good. He told Harrow he'd read the contract before signing anything. Harrow said, of course, take your time, and he looked like a man who already knew the answer. After Harrow left, Gideon sat at his desk with the contract and read through the first 8 pages. Standard language, mostly. Agreement terms. Defined access periods. Fee structures. He was about to set it down and come back to it when Mara appeared in the study door. He hadn't heard her approach. Is that a land contract? She asked. He looked up. Water rights agreement. Harrow. Do you know him? Something crossed her face. It was fast, and she controlled it, but he was watching her directly, and he saw it. I know the name, she said. Come look at this. She came across the room and stood beside the desk, and he pushed the contract toward her. She started reading. She read the way she did everything with her full attention, steady and methodical, not skimming. She turned to page 9. She stopped. He watched her read the same paragraph twice. There, she said. She put her finger on a clause midway down the page. Right there. He leaned over and read it. The language was dense cooperative access obligations, drought period provisions, senior rights subordination under consolidated management conditions. What does that mean? He asked. Because he was a rancher, not an attorney, and the words were doing something that his gut was telling him wasn't right, but that he couldn't entirely articulate. It means, Mara said, her voice flat and careful, that if this valley goes into a declared drought, which happens out here roughly every 4 or 5 years, Harrow's management company decides who gets water and in what order. And your senior rights, which currently put you at the front of the line, become subordinate to the consolidated agreement. Meaning he can give your water to someone else. The room was quiet. He's buying water rights, Gideon said. Not selling access. Yes, Mara said. He's dressing it up as an investment arrangement. But what he's acquiring is control over the thing that every ranch in this valley needs to survive a dry summer. Gideon looked at her. How do you know how to read this? She was quiet for a moment. My father had a homestead in Colorado, she said. Outside Pueblo. 160 acres. Good land, near a creek. He'd worked it for 11 years. She paused. When I was 17, a man came with an investment proposal. Water management. Development capital. Mutually beneficial arrangement. She said those last 3 words like something she'd memorized against her will. My father signed. Gideon waited. 3 summers later, there was a drought, Mara said. Bad one. And the clause in that contract meant the management company controlled water distribution. Our cattle got nothing. We lasted 1 season after that before the bank took the property. She looked at the contract on the desk. The man who brought my father that contract, she said, was Victor Harrow. Gideon didn't move for a long moment. You came to Red Willow, he said slowly, knowing he operates in this territory. I came to Red Willow because it's where the work was, Mara said. But yes, I've been following the pattern of his operations for years. I've taught myself enough about land and water law to recognize what he does and how he does it, because I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to stop him from doing it to someone else, she stopped. Don't sign that contract, she said. The fire in the study popped once. Gideon looked at Victor Harrow's careful, profitable, very well-constructed agreement. No, he said, I won't. He looked back at Mara, and she was watching him with an expression he hadn't quite seen on her face before. Not relief exactly. More like the particular feeling of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just, for a moment, been allowed to set it down. I'm going to need an attorney, he said. I know one, she said. He's in Red Willow. He's honest, which is rarer than it should be. A pause. His name is Everett Sloan. Gideon nodded. Then he stood up and closed the contract and looked at the woman standing in his study, the woman he'd hired to cook supper for one night, who had fixed his chicken coop and corrected his feed costs, and noticed his horse limping, and made his ranch hands laugh and kept the household accounts, and read land contracts like someone who had spent 13 years preparing for exactly this moment. "Mara," he said. She raised her eyes. "Whatever Harrow does next, and he will do something next, I need you to stay." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Everett Sloane's office was on the second floor of a building on Red Willow's Main Street, above a boot repair shop, and it smelled like leather and old paper, and the particular mustiness of a man who had been reading contracts in small rooms for 20 years. He was 54, thin through the shoulders. With reading glasses, he kept pushing up the bridge of his nose and a habit of writing things down while you were still talking, which Gideon found either reassuring or unsettling, depending on the moment. He read Harrow's contract in 11 minutes. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the desk and took off his glasses and looked at Gideon. "Where did you say this came from?" "Victor Harrow. Helena. He's been working the valley." Sloane tapped the page 9 clause with one finger. "This is not an accident," he said. "This language was constructed. Someone spent time on it." He looked at Mara, who was sitting across the desk with her hands folded in her lap and her expression neutral. "You caught this." "I recognized it," she said. "From where?" She told him the same thing she'd told Gideon the Colorado homestead. Her father, the drought clause, the loss of the land. Sloane listened without interrupting, which was a quality Gideon was beginning to appreciate in him. When she finished, Sloane was quiet for a moment. "How many ranchers has he approached in this valley?" he asked. "I don't know," Gideon said. He implied the agreement involved 4 other properties besides mine. Sloane stood up and went to a cabinet along the wall. He pulled out a ledger and opened it on the desk between them. "I've had 3 clients come through here in the last 6 weeks, with variations of this same document. Different language on the surface. Same clause buried in section 9 or 10. He looked up. 2 of them already signed. The room went quiet. "Who?" Gideon asked. "I can't tell you that. But I can tell you they're valley ranchers, and if a serious drought comes before those contracts can be challenged, Harrow's management company will have effective control over the primary water supply for most of the cattle operations north of the creek bend." Mara leaned forward. "Can the signed contracts be challenged?" "Possibly. Depends on whether we can establish a pattern of fraudulent intent rather than just aggressive contract terms. Courts are slow to undo a signed agreement on the grounds that it was a bad deal. But if we can show Harrow has used this same mechanism in other territories, specifically with the same results." He paused. "Do you have documentation from Colorado? Records of your father's contract? The drought period? The dispossession?" "I have some," Mara said. "Not everything. The original contract was taken when the property transferred. But I kept copies of the notices my father received. The drought management orders. The final bank transfer." Her voice was even. "I've been carrying them for 13 years. Sloane looked at her over his glasses. "Came here prepared." "I came here to work," she said. "I came prepared because I learned what happens when you aren't." He nodded slowly. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and picked up his pen. "All right, here's what I need from you." They were in that office for 3 hours. When they came back out onto the street, the afternoon had turned gray, and the wind off the mountains had picked up, carrying the smell of coming snow. Gideon walked beside Mara toward where Dale had left the wagon, and neither of them spoke for half a block. Then Mara said, "He thinks we can expose the whole thing." He said possibly. "Everett Sloane says possibly the way most men say probably," she said. "I've known his type. They understate, so they're never wrong." Gideon glanced at her. "How do you know his type?" "You've been in Red Willow 6 weeks." "I've been reading people my whole life," she said. "It's what you do when people are always deciding what to think about you before you open your mouth. You learn to read them faster than they read you." He thought about that for the rest of the drive back to the ranch. The next 2 weeks had a particular quality, the feeling of something quiet on the surface and building underneath. Mara kept the household running the way she always did. The kitchen warm, the accounts straight, the ranch hands fed, and occasionally redirected when they were about to do something inadvisable. But in the evenings, after the kitchen was clean and Mrs. Polly had gone to bed, she sat at the work table with papers spread around her and worked. Gideon started staying up later. He told himself it was the accounts. He told himself it was because he had correspondence to get through. He was not particularly convincing, even to himself, but he kept telling himself anyway. He'd bring his own papers to the kitchen and sit at the far end of the table and work, and they'd be in the same room for 2 or 3 hours sometimes, without talking much. Just the sound of the fire and the scratch of pens, and occasionally one of them saying something that needed saying. One night she looked up from a document and said, "Your mother built this kitchen." He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way it's laid out. The garden placement, the window position over the sink. The peg rail height, it's set for someone shorter than you. And there are things in this kitchen that aren't practical things. That painted tin on the shelf. The way the herbs were sorted in the larder, alphabetical. That's somebody's system. Somebody who cared about the room." She paused. "You don't cook." "So it wasn't you." He was quiet for a moment. "She died 7 years ago." "I know," Mara said. "Mrs. Polly told me." "I'm sorry. 7 years and I still haven't gone through the East Wing," he said, and he wasn't sure why he said it. He hadn't said it to anyone. Mara didn't tell him he should. She didn't say anything comforting or fix the silence with words it didn't need. She just looked at him steadily and then looked back at her papers. "When you're ready," she said. That was all. He sat with that for a long time. The first sign that Harrow had noticed the threat came on a Wednesday in the form of a rumor. Dale heard it at the feed store. Someone was saying that Gideon Blackwell's new cook had been let go from a boarding house in Laramie for skimming the household accounts. That before that, she'd been dismissed from a restaurant in Denver for the same reason. That she had a pattern of working her way into positions of trust and walking away with money that wasn't hers. Dale came back to the ranch with a jaw so tight, Gideon could see the muscles working from across the yard. "Someone's talking," Dale said. "I know who," Gideon said. "It's not true," Dale said, and there was something fierce in how he said it. The way a person says something they need to establish as a fact before they can continue. "Not a word of it is true. I found Mara. I checked her references. The boarding house let her go because the owner's wife didn't like her. I talked to 3 of the boarders myself. In Denver, she was let go because the restaurant changed ownership and the new owner brought his own people. There was nothing wrong. There was never anything wrong." "I know that," Gideon said. "Then someone needs to hear it." "I know that too." He found Mara in the barn. She was checking the horse's water, just doing it, because she'd noticed the trough level was low and she was nearby. She had a bucket in her hand and mud on the hem of her dress, and she looked up when he came in, and something in his face told her what he'd come to say. She set the bucket down. He told her what Dale had heard. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the middle distance, past the horses, at nothing specific. He could see her working through it, not deciding whether to be hurt, because she already was, but deciding what to do with it. "Laramie," she said flatly. "I've never been to Laramie." "I know." He's not even trying to be accurate. He just wants enough noise that people start wondering. She picked the bucket back up. That's what he does when someone gets close to something. He makes noise about them instead of about the thing. "It's going to get worse," Gideon said. "Yes. It's going to be personal." She looked at him. "It's already personal, Gideon." It was the first time she'd used his first name. She didn't seem to notice. "It's always been personal. Men like Harrow, the personal attack isn't a tactic they pick up when things get difficult. It's the first tool they reach for. I'm an easy target. I'm a woman. I'm unmarried. I'm large. I have no family here. No standing." She said it like a list she'd memorized. "He'll use all of it. Let him." She looked at him more carefully. "He can say whatever he wants about me," Gideon said. "He'll say it to a room where I'm standing, and then we'll see how far it goes." Studied him for a moment. There was something cautious in her expression, like a person testing weight on a floor they're not sure will hold. "You don't owe me that," she said. "I'm not doing it because I owe you." She held his gaze for a few seconds longer. Then she went back to filling the trough, and he stood in the barn doorway, watching the gray afternoon, and feeling something that had been sitting quietly in his chest for several weeks beginning to get louder. The dinner happened 4 days later. It was a cattle business gathering at the Harrow Connected Social Club at the north end of Red Willow, the kind of event Gideon normally avoided, but that 4 of his major cattle buyers attended, which meant he went. He brought Dale. He did not tell Dale what he expected to happen. Mara was not there. She hadn't been invited. She wouldn't have been invited. That was part of the point. Harrow was there. standing near the fireplace in the well-lit front room with 3 other men, wearing his good coat, looking like someone whose plans were progressing exactly as expected. He greeted Gideon with a handshake that was slightly too confident, the handshake of a man who believed he was still holding all the cards. Blackwell, I trust you've had time to review the proposal. I have, Gideon said, and I won't be signing it. Harrow's expression didn't collapse. It just adjusted, the way a card player adjusts when a hand goes differently than expected. I'd encourage you to reconsider. The other Valley ranchers involved have found it very sound. I'm sure they've found it exactly what you needed them to find it, Gideon said. The men near the fireplace had gone still. Harrow's voice lowered. I'd be careful about the company you keep these days, Gideon. I've heard things about the woman running your household that would concern most employers. Gideon looked at him directly. She's done more useful work before breakfast than you've done since arriving in this valley, he said. And the next person who makes a claim about her character in my presence can explain themselves to my face. The room was quiet. Harrow smiled, the way a man smiles when he's decided to switch tactics. Your loyalty is admirable, he said smoothly. I hope it's warranted. Gideon held his gaze for another moment, then turned and spoke to his cattle buyers about an entirely different subject, and Harrow spent the rest of the evening on the other side of the room. Dale said nothing on the ride back to the ranch. Then about a mile out, that's going to cost us. Probably, Gideon said. But you'd do it again. Already did it twice. Dale was quiet. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh. All right then. When they got back to the ranch, the kitchen light was on. Mara was still at the table with her papers. She looked up when Gideon came through the door, and she read to his face the way she read everything carefully and accurately. How did it go, she asked. Fine, he said. That means something happened. Several things happened. He poured coffee from the pot on the range and sat down across from her. Harrow mentioned you. I expected that. I mentioned you back. She was quiet. Her pen was still in her hand. She set it down. What did you say? He told her, almost word for word. She looked at him for a long time after that, not with the expression of someone who was grateful, exactly. More like someone who had been bracing for a particular kind of pain for a long time and had just discovered it wasn't coming from the direction they were watching. You didn't have to do that, she said. You said that already. I meant it the first time too. And I meant my answer, he said, both times. She looked down at her papers. He could see something working through her expression, something she was deciding not to say, or deciding how to say, or deciding whether it mattered. He waited. She picked her pen back up. Harrow's going to escalate, she said. The social damage isn't working. He'll try something with the water directly. Make a move before Sloan can build a case. That's what I think too. We need those Colorado records corroborated, she said. And we need the original territorial survey for Silver Fork. The water rights documentation. Where's the survey? County Records Office, she said. Millbrook, about 40 miles east. He thought about that. I'll send Dale. Dale doesn't know what he's looking for, she said. I do. He looked at her. 40 miles, he said. I'm aware of the distance, she said. I know how to ride. He didn't argue with her. He'd learned, over the past weeks, that arguing with Mara on practical matters was almost always a losing proposition. She was right more often than she was wrong, and she knew when she was right, which was a quality he'd found maddening initially and had come to find something else entirely. We'll go together, he said. She looked up. When? She asked. When Sloan tells us we need it, he said. He's watching Harrow. When Harrow moves, we'll know. She nodded and went back to her papers. And Gideon drank his coffee and looked at the lamp flame on the table between them. And outside the wind was picking up off the mountains in a way that meant weather was coming. And the house around them was quiet but not empty. It was a distinction he'd stopped taking for granted. The rumors in Red Willow got worse the following week. They escalated from professional to personal in the way Mara had predicted, from accusations about stolen money to something uglier. People were saying she'd worked her way into Gideon's house through means that had nothing to do with cooking. That a man like Blackwell wouldn't keep a woman like that around unless she was offering something beyond household management. The jokes that circulated in the saloon were the kind that reduced Mara to her body, her size, her appetites, her supposed leverage. Mara heard some of it herself. She'd gone into town for supplies on a Thursday, driving the smaller wagon, and 2 women outside the dry goods store had not bothered to lower their voices when she passed. They hadn't said anything directly to her. They hadn't needed to. The words were loud enough, and they carried enough of the particular sharpness that women aim at other women when they want to cut something they can't name. Came back to the ranch and unloaded the wagon herself and put everything away and didn't say anything about it to anyone. Gideon found out from Mrs. Pauley, who had heard it from Cord, who had been in town at the same time, and had the expression of a 19-year-old who had heard adults be deliberately cruel and didn't know what to do with it. He found Mara in the kitchen that evening. She was making bread, working the dough with a focused physical intensity that suggested she was working something else through at the same time. I heard about Thursday, he said. She didn't stop kneading. It's not the first time. I know it isn't. She turned the dough over. Her hands were strong and certain, pressing the heel of her palm into the mass of it. When I was 22, she said, not looking up, I applied for a cook's position at a hotel in Pueblo. The owner looked at me for about 3 seconds and said he needed someone who would represent the establishment well. She paused. I went home and spent 2 hours deciding whether to cry or not. I decided not. She turned the dough again. I've been deciding not for a long time. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. She stopped. She stood with her hands in the dough and stared at the table for a moment. No, she said quietly. It doesn't mean that. He came to stand at the other end of the table. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, which was what the moment needed. You could go, she said. It would be easier. They'd stop talking. You'd stop being the punchline. I'm not the punchline. In their version of this story, you are, she said. The lonely rancher who got taken in by the large woman with the big personality. That's the joke they're telling. Then they don't know me very well, he said. She looked up at him. Mara. He held her gaze. Do you want to leave? She didn't answer immediately. No, she said. Then don't let cowards make the decision for you. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite belief, but the thing that comes just before belief, when a person is weighing whether the ground is solid enough to step on. Then she went back to kneading the bread, and Gideon poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the table, and they stayed like that for a while, which was its own kind of answer. The following morning, he told Dale to get the wagon ready. We're going to town, he said. Dale looked at him. We were just in town. We're going again. Both of you? Yes. Dale's expression did not change. I'll get the wagon, he said. Red Willow on a Saturday morning was as busy as it got the street full of wagons, the mercantile crowded, the usual movement of a small town going about its weekend business. Gideon drove the wagon to the front of Hartley's Mercantile, which was the largest and most central establishment in town, and tied the horses and walked around to help Mara down. She didn't need help. She got down herself, but she let him offer the hand, and she took it briefly, and then they walked into Hartley's together. The Mercantile was full. Gideon was aware of the room adjusting. He'd been aware of rooms adjusting his entire adult life. He was a known person in Red Willow, and when Gideon Blackwell walked into a space, people noticed. What was different today was that they were also noticing who was walking in beside him. He went to the counter and asked for 2 things he needed, and while Hartley was pulling them, he turned to the room. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't make a speech. He simply spoke at a volume that reached the corners. If anyone in this room has a question about the woman managing Blackwell Ranch, he said, the integrity of her work or her place on my property, I'd invite them to bring it to me directly. I'll be available. He turned back to the counter. The room was quiet for a long time. Mara was standing to his left, looking at the bolts of fabric along the wall with an expression of complete composure that cost her something. He suspected to maintain. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. They both looked at what they were looking at. But he could feel, in the particular way you feel something from the person standing nearest to you, that she was breathing carefully. The way a person breathes when they are trying not to let something out. They bought what they needed. They walked back to the wagon. Dale was waiting with the expression of a man who had not been present for the event in the Mercantile and had therefore not prepared a face for it. Well, Dale said. Don't, Gideon said. I wasn't going to say a word, Dale said. They drove back out of town, and Mara sat beside Gideon on the bench and looked at the road ahead, and after about a mile, she said, in a different voice than she usually used, quieter. More careful. I haven't had anyone do that for me before. Kept his eyes on the road. It needed doing. Most people decide it's not worth the trouble. Then most people are wrong, he said. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't look away from the road either, and the rest of the drive back was quiet, in a way that felt full rather than empty, which was something Gideon was learning to tell the difference between. 3 days later, Sloan sent a message. Harrow had filed a new claim, a water diversion permit, territorial level, for the eastern branch of Silver Fork Creek. The claim was dated 2 weeks back, which meant he'd filed it before the conversation in the social club, before Gideon had turned down the contract. He'd been preparing this in parallel from the start. Permit, if recognized, would effectively give Harrow the right to divert a portion of Silver Fork during any period he could argue was necessary for regional water management development, and the hearing was scheduled for 12 days out. Gideon read the message standing in his study. Then he went to find Mara. She was already reading her copy. Sloan had apparently sent a rider to the ranch directly. The original survey, she said when she saw him. Millbrook, he said. If the original territorial grant documents clearly establish senior riparian rights, without the cooperative clause language, Harrow's permit can't stand, she said. But we have to have them at the hearing. Sloan can argue the legal framework. We need the physical documentation. 12 days. 11 now, she said, and the weather's turning. She was looking at the sky through the kitchen window. The clouds over the mountains had the particular heaviness of early winter, the gray-white density that meant serious snow was coming. We need to go soon, tomorrow, he said. She looked at him. I already said I was going with you, he said. She started to say something he could see it forming, the familiar shape of her insistence that she didn't require accompanying, that she'd managed longer distances alone before. He waited, she stopped. Before sunrise, she said instead. We want the daylight. Before sunrise, he agreed. That night, Mara sat at the kitchen table later than usual. The papers were spread around her, the notices from her father's case, the copies she'd carried for 13 years in the bottom of a traveling bag, worn at the folds from being opened and refolded so many times. She didn't read them. She just looked at them. She'd been 17 when her father signed Victor Harrow's contract. She remembered the day, a Sunday, her father at the table with his best pen, the investor's man sitting across from him being pleasant and agreeable, her father's hand moving with the careful, slow deliberateness of someone signing something important. Her father had looked up at her when he finished and smiled in the particular way of a man who believes he has just done something good for his family. She'd been in that kitchen when the drought management orders arrived 4 years later. She'd been in that kitchen when the bank representative came. She'd been in that kitchen when her father sat down at the table the day after the property transferred and put his flat on the wood and didn't say anything for a very long time. He died of fever 2 years later. She didn't know how much the loss of the homestead had to do with it. She suspected the answer was more than she could calculate. She folded the papers carefully and put them back in their envelope. She'd done the only thing she knew how to do after that. She'd worked, and she'd learned, and she'd moved from place to place carrying the knowledge she was building. And she had told herself that patience was a form of preparation, that the time would come. She hadn't expected it to come in a ranch kitchen in Montana with a quiet, difficult, unexpectedly decent rancher who chopped her firewood without being asked and ate breakfast standing at the counter so she wouldn't have to eat alone. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She'd spent so long getting used to having nothing like it that she'd stopped building the architecture to receive it. Put the envelope in her bag and blew out the lamp. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall light. Preliminary, just enough to dust the yard white. She stood at the window for a moment looking at it. Tomorrow they rode for Millbrook. Whatever was coming next was going to come, regardless of whether she was ready. She'd spent 13 years getting ready. She went to bed. The snow that had started as a dusting the night before had stopped by morning, leaving the yard white and the air with that particular cold clarity that comes after first snow, when everything smells clean and the mountains look closer than they are. Mara was already in the barn when Gideon came out before sunrise, saddling the bay gelding Dale had readied the night before. She was working efficiently, her breath fogging in the cold air, wearing a heavy wool coat that was not quite heavy enough for what the sky was promising. He didn't say anything about the coat. He saddled Juniper, and they rode out while the ranch was still dark, the hands still sleeping, just the two of them moving east along the frozen road, with the first gray light beginning to separate the mountains from the sky. For the first hour they didn't talk much. The road was hard, and the horses moved well in the cold, and there was something about the early morning and the open land that made conversation feel unnecessary. Gideon had always been comfortable with silence. He'd spent 7 years cultivating it. What was different now was that the silence beside him didn't feel like absence. Mara rode competently, not elegantly, not with the kind of effortless ease that people who'd grown up on horseback sometimes had, but solidly, correctly, like someone who had learned what they needed to learn and had no patience for embellishment. She sat her weight well, kept her hands quiet on the reins, and watched the road ahead with the same steady attention she gave everything. About 12 miles out, she said, "Tell me about the creek." He glanced at her. "Silver Fork?" "The eastern branch. The one Harrow wants." "Tell me what it does." He thought about it. "Runs out of the mountain snowmelt in the spring, feeds 3 natural ponds on the north end of my property, runs through the Henderson spread and 2 smaller operations before it joins the main branch near the valley floor. In a dry summer, it's the only reliable water source for anything north of the bend. The main branch can drop to near nothing by August. And the senior writes how long have they been with Blackwell Ranch. Original territorial grant, he said. 1,862. Before the ranch was mine. Before it was my father's. My grandfather staked the claim. That's 24 years of documented precedent, she said. That's what Sloan is going to lean on. Harrow's diversion permit is dated recent. He can't establish historical use or senior standing. But he'll argue management necessity, regional benefit, public good. That's how those permits get approved when they shouldn't. She paused. The original survey will show the grant boundary. If the survey predates any of Harrow's company documentation by the years it should, the permit argument collapses. "You know a great deal about water law," he said. "I know what I had to learn," she said. Not proud, not modest. Just accurate. They rode in silence for another stretch. Then she said, without looking at him, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When you decided not to sign Harrow's contract, before I told you about my father, before you knew any of the history, what made you hesitate?" He considered this honestly. "Something in the room," he said, when Harrow was talking. The way he answered before I finished asking. The way he made the numbers feel settled when they shouldn't have been settled yet. A deal that good shouldn't feel that easy. He paused. "I've bought cattle from dishonest men. You learn to feel it before you can name it." She nodded slowly. "My father felt it too," she said. "He told me afterward. He said there was something in the room that afternoon that made him uneasy. But the man was professional, and the money was real, and my father was tired, and the thought of additional capital was what he needed to hear." She was quiet for a moment. He signed because he was tired, and because the man made him feel foolish for hesitating. Gideon didn't say anything. "Harrow's good at that," she said, making the hesitation feel like the problem. The road curved northeast, and the mountains came into clearer view, white above the tree line, and the sky was doing something complicated overhead, high cloud moving fast from the northwest. Kind of movement that meant weather was reorganizing itself somewhere up in the elevation, and would send whatever it decided downstream eventually. "How long have you been carrying this?" he asked. She didn't ask what he meant. "Since I was 17, she said. "Some days I barely feel it. Some days it's the first thing I think about when I wake up." She shifted in the saddle. "I used to be angry all the time. That kind of angry that makes you sharp and short with people, and you think it's keeping you safe, but it's mostly just making you alone." She paused. "I got tired of being alone. And then I decided the anger wasn't useful unless it was pointed at something," she said. "So I pointed it. I learned what I needed to learn. I moved toward where Harrow was operating, because eventually he was going to do it again to someone, and if I was close enough and knew enough." She stopped. "I didn't have a perfect plan. I just had a direction." He looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the way she was looking at the road, with that steady brown gaze that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her, and that he'd been noticing, in various forms, ever since. "Your direction brought you to my kitchen," he said. She glanced at him. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. "Your kitchen needed someone," she said. "And I needed a kitchen." He almost said something then. He came close enough that he was aware of stopping himself, which was not something he was accustomed to being aware of. Turned his eyes back to the road, and they rode on. Millbrook was a small county seat smaller than Red Willow, quieter, a courthouse that was too big for the town around it, in the way of government buildings built with ambitions the population hadn't kept pace with. They arrived in the early afternoon, the horses tired and blowing, and tied up on the courthouse side of the main street. The county records clerk was a man named Purvis, who was approximately 100 years old, and moved through the document stacks with the particular slow certainty of someone who knew exactly where everything was and would not be hurried about getting it. He looked at Mara over half glasses when she stated what she needed, and then he looked at Gideon, and then he looked back at Mara. Territorial grant records from 1862, he said. Silver Fork Creek, Eastern Branch. The original survey and rights documentation for the land designated in the Blackwell territorial claim. That'll be in the pre-statehood land rolls, Purvis said. East Cabinet, third shelf bound in brown. Can we look at them here? That's what the table's for, he said, and went slowly back to his desk. It took them 40 minutes to find what they needed. The documents were in 2 large bound folios, pages brittle at the edges and written in the careful hand of a government surveyor who had done his job with a thoroughness, a man who understood that the lines he drew would matter for a long time. The original survey of Silver Fork Creek's eastern branch was on page 14 of the second folio, dated August 1862, with the Blackwell claim clearly marked and the water rights notation in the margin, senior riparian claim, undivided, pertinent to granted land, no conditional clauses. Mara put her finger on that notation. No conditional clauses, she said, meaning Harrow's cooperative management language has no basis in the original grant, Gideon said, meaning any permit that attempts to impose conditions on these rights is working against the original documentation, she said. Sloan is going to want certified copies of these pages. All of them. It took Purvis another hour to prepare the certified copies. He did it himself, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood the weight of his office. And Mara sat at the table and read through the surrounding documents while she waited, pulling out anything else that might be relevant, while Gideon stood at the window and watched the sky. The sky was doing more now. The clouds from the northwest had dropped lower and darkened, and the wind along the street outside had picked up enough to move the sign above the hardware store across the way. He'd grown up reading Montana weather, and he knew what this particular combination of signs was building toward. He went to Mara. "We need to start back," he said quietly. She looked up from the documents. Then she looked past him at the window. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Few hours, maybe less. Depends how fast it's moving." He paused. "If we leave now, we make it back before the worst of it. If we wait for all the copies." "We need the copies," she said. He looked at her. "Sloan needs certified copies," she said. "Uncertified versions aren't enough for the hearing." "We wait." He waited. He didn't like it, but she was right. "Tell Purvis to move faster," he said. She looked at him with an expression that suggests she found that suggestion mildly unrealistic. But she went to Purvis and spoke to him quietly. And something in whatever she said caused the old man to nod and pick up his pace by approximately 15%, which was not fast, but was faster. They left Millbrook with the certified copies in Mara's saddlebag 40 minutes later, and the sky had made its decision while they were inside. Clouds had closed over entirely. The temperature had dropped a hard 10 degrees, and the first serious snow was starting, not the light preliminary dusting of the previous night, but the real thing, thick and horizontal, driven by a northwest wind that had real intent behind it. Gideon set the pace faster than was comfortable, and Mara didn't argue. The horses were rested from standing and moved well initially, and for the first 5 miles the road was clear enough to follow without difficulty. Then the snow thickened and the light began to flatten, in the way it does when the sky and ground become the same color, and the roads started to disappear under the accumulation. Mara was riding beside him, and he could see her jaw was set and her face was reddening in the cold. Coat she'd worn was wool, and it was wet through at the shoulders now, the snow not sloughing off but sinking in. And she was holding herself together by the kind of internal stubbornness that he'd come to recognize as one of her primary operating principles. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She glanced at him. "I'm cold," she said. "I'm fine and I'm cold. Both are true." About 20 miles from Red Willow, the road dropped down toward a creek crossing, and the slope leading to it was iced over beneath the new snow invisible until Juniper's front hooves hit it, and the mare's legs skidded, and she lurched. Sideways. going down on one knee before catching herself. Gideon held on, barely, his weight shifting hard right, and for one bad second Juniper was going to go all the way over and take him with her. Mara reacted before he had time to think. She came up alongside on the gelding, cutting across the slope at an angle, and grabbed Juniper's bridle with her left hand, her own horse's momentum helping pull the mare back to a footing. It wasn't graceful. The gelding slipped too, found his feet, and for a moment all four of them, 2 horses and 2 people, were doing something unrepeatable on an icy slope in a blizzard. Then Juniper steadied. Gideon sat up straight and looked at Mara, who was still holding Juniper's bridle, her face about 2 feet from his, both of them breathing hard. "You all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Your horse?" Checked. Juniper was breathing fast but standing sound. "No injury." "Lucky. She's fine," he said. Mara let go of the bridle and straightened on the gelding. Her hand was shaking slightly, the aftermath of the adrenaline, he recognized, not weakness. She pressed it flat against her thigh and looked away. "Thank you," he said. "You'd have caught yourself," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But you were faster." She didn't respond to that. She just looked at the iced slope below and said, "We go around. There should be a higher crossing about a 1/4 mile north, less exposure." He didn't argue about who was navigating. He followed her north along the ridge, and she found the crossing, and they got across without incident and pushed on through the snow, which was still falling hard. They made it back to the ranch 2 hours after dark. Dale was waiting in the barn with a lamp, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for a while and was not going to say everything he was thinking. "Took longer than expected," Gideon said. "Weather came in faster than expected," Dale said. "We got the documents." Dale looked at Mara, who was dismounting with the stiffness of someone who had been cold and wet on horseback for 6 hours. "There's hot food on the range," he said, which was the most direct expression of concern he was capable of. "Thank you, Dale," Mara said, and her voice had a roughness in it that she didn't try to hide. Inside, Mrs. Polly had left a pot of something on the range, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and Mara stood at the range for a full minute before she did anything else, just letting the heat work into her hands and face. Gideon hung his coat and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at the counter beside her without a word. She picked it up with both hands.
They ate standing at the counter because neither of them had the particular energy required to sit at the
table and be deliberate about it. The food was a thick beef stew that had been going since afternoon and had reached the stage of readiness that comes from long, slow cooking when nobody was watching, deep and dark, and exactly what the evening required. "We got what we needed," Mara said after a while. "We did. Sloan will have the documents tomorrow. I'll ride out in the morning." She nodded. She was warming up, color coming back into her face. She still had the roughed quality of the cold in her hair coming down from its pins, coat drying on the hook by the door, the mud of the creek crossing still on her boots. He thought she looked exactly like what she was, a person who had just ridden 40 miles in bad weather to retrieve documents that could protect a valley full of people, half of whom had spent the last 2 weeks saying cruel things about her in public spaces. He thought about saying that. He didn't. "Get some sleep," he said instead. She looked at him sideways. "You too." He went upstairs. He lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind work at the eaves, and thought about a 17-year-old girl standing in a kitchen in Colorado, watching her father sign a piece of paper. Sloan sent a writer the next morning before Gideon had finished breakfast. The message was short. Harrow had moved faster than expected. He had not waited for the hearing. Sometime in the previous 36 hours, while Gideon and Mara were riding to Millbrook and back, Harrow's men had been seen at the eastern branch of Silver Fork, upstream from the main Blackwell property line. A neighboring rancher named Pruitt had ridden the creek that morning and found a temporary diversion structure in place. Logs, packed earth, channel redirected southward, away from the ponds on Blackwell's north end. He'd done it without waiting for the permit to be recognized. He was presenting facts on the ground. Gideon read the message standing in the kitchen. Mara read it over his shoulder. "He knows we went to Millbrook," she said. "Or he guessed we would. He has eyes in town," Gideon said. "Same as everyone. He's trying to establish use," she said. "Even temporary. Even illegal. If the diversion sits there long enough that he can claim established practice. Can't claim established practice in a week." "No," she said. "But he can muddy the hearing, complicate the documentation. Make Sloan argue 2 things instead of 1. She put the message down. And if the winter gets hard and the creek drops. Pruitt's cattle, Gideon said. And 2 other operations that run along that branch, she said. If this winter goes cold and dry and that diversion is still in place in February. She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Gideon was already reaching for his coat. I'm coming with you, she said. I know, he said. Dale and 3 of the ranch hands rode out with them to the creek. They found it the way Pruitt had described, a rough but effective diversion, maybe a day's work for 4 men with the right materials, channeling the eastern branch away from its natural path into a shallow cutoff that ran south along a dry gully. It wasn't professional engineering. It was fast, deliberate, and sufficient. Dale crouched at the edge of the diversion structure and looked at the construction. That's not last night's work, he said. This was built when the ground was drier, before the snow. They've been planning this. While he was still offering me the contract, Gideon said. While he was offering everybody the contract, Mara said. She was standing at the edge of the bank looking upstream, reading the water the way she read everything. He needed the contracts to create legal cover for what he was already planning to do without them. If the Valley Ranchers had all signed, this diversion would have been the first exercise of the cooperative management language. She looked at Gideon. Since they didn't all sign, this is just a land crime. Can we tear it out? Cord asked. He was the youngest of the hands, still at the age where problems felt like they had direct physical solutions. Not without potentially making our own legal situation complicated, Mara said. We're not the party with enforcement authority here. Then who is? Cord asked. The territorial court, she said. Which is why we need Sloan at that hearing with everything we have. They rode back to the ranch, and Gideon spent an hour writing 2 letters, one to Sloan with the morning's information, one to Pruitt and the other affected ranchers to coordinate what they'd seen and when. Mara sat at the table, writing her own document, a clear account of the Colorado case, structured for legal use, naming Harrow explicitly and detailing the drought clause mechanism and its consequences. Her handwriting, he noticed again, was small and precise and relentless. You're writing it formally, he said. Sloan needs something he can put in front of the judge, she said. Not a personal story. A documented account with dates and amounts and consequences. She paused. I've written versions of this before. Letters to lawyers in Colorado. Letters to the Territorial Land Office. 3 years of letters that went nowhere because I had no standing and no evidence that fit the format they needed. She kept writing. Now I have both. He watched her write. She was hunched slightly over the paper, a small frown of concentration between her brows. Her thick, dark hair pinned up imperfectly after the previous day's ride, a smudge of ink on the side of her hand where she'd turned the page too fast. She was nothing like the women he'd grown up being told were worth admiring. She was loud when she needed to be loud and quiet when she was thinking, and stubborn about things that mattered, and occasionally wrong about small things, and entirely certain about large ones. And she ate her breakfast standing at the counter sometimes, and she'd grabbed a horse's bridle on an icy slope in a blizzard without hesitating. And he was in serious trouble and had been for some time. He went back to his own letters and said nothing. The rumors shifted that week. When word got out, and it did get out, because Pruitt talked, and Pruitt knew people that Harrow had diverted the creek before his permit was even recognized, the nature of the conversation in Red Willow changed. It was one thing to believe that a land investor was aggressive in his negotiations. It was another to understand that he had physically moved a water source without authorization. 3 ranchers came to see Sloan in 2 days. On the 3rd day, a woman named Clara Hendricks, who ran a 100-acre operation with her 2 sons after her husband's death the previous year, came to see Gideon. She sat in his kitchen, Mara's kitchen, as everyone had started calling it, though Mara hadn't called it that, and she had the angular, weathered look of a woman who had been managing alone longer than she'd planned to and had made her peace with it. I signed Harrow's paper, she said. She said it straight out, without preamble, the way people say things they've been sitting with for a while and have decided to stop carrying alone. 2 months ago, my oldest boy thought it was a good idea, and I let myself be persuaded. She put her hands flat on the table. The attorney I used to see retired last year. I didn't have anyone else look at it. Mara was at the range, not looking at them, but she was listening. Gideon knew she was listening. Sloan is working on whether those contracts can be challenged, Gideon said. I heard. Clara looked at her hands. I heard she found the clause. A pause. Your cook. Her name is Mara Ellison, Gideon said. She manages my household accounts, among other things. Clara looked up. She glanced toward the range where Mara was working. Mrs. Ellison, she said, I owe you an apology. Mara turned around. She leaned back against the range and looked at Clara with an expression that was neither forgiving nor unforgiving, but just present. What for? She said. Clara held her gaze. For the things I let people say without correcting them, she said. I don't repeat gossip, but I didn't stop it either. And a woman who didn't stop it, she stopped. That's not much different. A silence. Then Mara said, How many head of cattle do you run? Clara blinked. 60, 70 in a good year. And the creek branch runs through the southeast corner of your property. Yes. Then you need to be at the hearing, Mara said. Whatever Sloan needs from you, dates, signed documents, anything you have from the original transaction, get it to him before the end of the week. Clara nodded. She looked like a woman who had come prepared to do more apologizing and had been redirected towards something more useful, and was grateful for it. I'll bring what I have tomorrow, she said. Good, Mara said, and turned back to the range. Clara looked at Gideon. He said nothing. She left, and the kitchen was quiet, and Mara said without turning around, She's not the only one who signed. I know. There are going to be more of them, she said. People who feel foolish. People who are afraid. If Sloan can build the case properly. He'll build it, Gideon said. She stirred what was on the range. I'm not used to this, she said after a moment. He looked at her back. To what? To having it matter, she said. To being in the middle of something that's moving. Usually I'm on the outside, pushing at something that isn't moving at all. She paused. I don't quite know what to do with it. You seem to be managing, he said. She made a sound, half a laugh, dry and real. I'm doing what I always do, she said. Working, pushing, trying to see 3 moves ahead. She paused. I'm not sure I know another way. That's not a flaw, he said. She turned around then. She leaned against the range and looked at him across the kitchen, and the lamp between them made the room warm and yellow the way it always did in the evenings now. And she looked at him for a long moment with that steady brown gaze that had stopped him cold the first day she'd walked into his yard. I don't know what's going to happen at that hearing, she said. Neither do I, he said. Harrow is not going to go quietly, she said. Whatever we bring, he'll have something. He'll have an attorney who's better dressed than Sloan and has spent more time in territorial courtrooms. He'll use whatever he can. She paused. He'll use me. I know. He'll put me in front of that room and make everything about who I am instead of what I found, she said. My size, my history, my employment record, my relationship to you, everything. She said it evenly. I want you to know that I know that. Going in. And, he said. She straightened away from the range. And I'm going anyway, she said. He looked at her. I know, he said. That was never in question. She picked up her spoon and went back to what was on the range. And outside the wind had come back off the mountains, with the particular sound of a winter that intended to stay. And inside the kitchen was warm. And the house around them was full of the small sounds of people living in it, Mrs. Polly moving slowly down the hallway, the ranch hands in the bunkhouse, the horses in the barn, and Mara Ellison was at the range in the middle of it, holding the whole thing together the way she'd been holding things together her entire life. And Gideon Blackwell stood in his own kitchen and understood, fully and without any remaining ambiguity, exactly what she had come to mean to him. Still didn't say it. But it was the first night he stopped pretending he didn't know. The hearing was set for a Thursday, which gave them 4 days after the creek diversion was discovered to build what Sloan needed. Those 4 days had the quality of a clock running down. Sloan came to the ranch on Monday morning, which was itself unusual. He was not a man who made house calls, and he spread his documents across Gideon's study desk and stood over them with the particular stillness of someone who had been awake too long and was operating on the precision that comes after exhaustion burns away everything unnecessary. Here's where we stand, he said. The certified survey from Millbrook establishes Blackwell's senior rights without question. Mara's documented account of the Colorado case is exactly what I needed. The language correlation between the 2 contracts is damning on its own. And I now have 4 Valley ranchers willing to testify that Harrow's representatives made verbal representations that contradict the written contract terms. He paused. What I don't have is a direct evidentiary link between Harrow personally and the diversion structure on the creek. His men built it, Gideon said. His men, yes. Men who will claim they were following instructions from an intermediary, who will claim he was acting on a contractor's interpretation of a permit that hasn't been finalized, who will claim the whole thing was a miscommunication. Sloane took off his glasses and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Harrow is good at distance. He never touches the actual wrongdoing himself. There are always 2 or 3 layers between him and the thing he did, like the contracts, Mara said. She was standing near the window, had been standing there for most of the conversation, listening. Exactly like the contracts, Sloane said. The clause that does the damage is buried in language that a general attorney might read 3 times and still not catch. It's not accident. That's architecture. So what do we do about the distance? Gideon asked. We close it, Sloane said, which means we need the Colorado records I asked about, not the copies Mara has, but the originals or certified copies from the Colorado Territorial Land Office. If I can show the judge the same pattern in writing from a different jurisdiction, it stops being a local contract dispute and becomes evidence of a systematic practice. He looked at Mara. You said you'd written to the Colorado Land Office 3 years ago. Twice, she said. Neither letter was answered. I wrote to them on Friday, Sloane said, with different stationery. He said it simply, without satisfaction. Just a fact. I have a contact there from my years in Denver. He'll expedite what he can, but I'm not certain what will arrive before Thursday. He looked between them. I also want Mara to be prepared to speak. Not as a witness in a formal sense, the hearing structure doesn't require sworn testimony. But the ranchers in that room need to understand what they signed. They need someone to explain the clause to them in language that doesn't require a law degree. Mara was quiet. You want me to speak in front of a room full of people who have spent the last 3 weeks calling me a fraud and a manipulator, she said. Yes, Sloane said. He didn't soften it. Because you're the only person in that room who can explain what that contract actually does, in terms a working rancher will understand. And because your presence there, standing up and saying it directly, is going to matter more than you think. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Sloane packed up his papers and left, and the study was quiet. Gideon looked at Mara. She was still by the window, looking out at the yard, where the snow from the previous days had packed down and gone gray at the edges. Her arms were folded across her chest, not the way someone folds their arms when they're cold, but the way someone holds themselves together when they're working through something. You don't have to be in that room, he said. She turned. Yes, I do. Sloane is a good attorney, she said. But he didn't lose his father's land. He didn't spend 13 years learning to read contracts because the alternative was being powerless again. She unfolded her arms. I have to be there. Not for Sloane, not for the hearing. A pause. For the girl who stood in that Colorado kitchen and watched her father sign. He held her gaze. I'll be there, he said. I know, she said. I've known that for a while. The next 2 days were the kind of busy that doesn't feel productive while it's happening. Sloane sent messages twice daily. Ranchers came and went from the property Pruitt, the Hendricks widow Clara, 2 brothers named Rourke, who ran a mid-size operation east of the creek bend and had, it turned out, refused to sign Harrow's contract on instinct without fully understanding why. Dale spent both days riding the creek line with Gideon, documenting the extent of the diversion, measuring the water reduction at the downstream pond with a stick marked at regular intervals, writing the numbers in a notebook that Mara had given him with instructions on what to record and how. She told you how to take water measurements? Gideon asked him on the second afternoon. She told me how to do it, so it's useful in a legal context, Dale said, not looking up from the notebook. There's a difference between knowing something and knowing it in a way that can be read in a courtroom. Gideon looked at him. Dale kept writing. She's something else, he said. It wasn't elaboration. It was a complete sentence. Yes, Gideon said. She is. The night before the hearing, Gideon came downstairs at close to midnight and found Mara in the kitchen. This was not surprising. What was surprising was that she wasn't at the table with papers. She was sitting on the kitchen stool near the range with a cup of something warm and her hands around it and nothing else in front of her. Just sitting, which he had never seen her do. He came in and poured himself a cup of the same thing. It was a weak tea, plain, the kind of thing you make when you don't want coffee, but need something warm in your hands, and he sat on the other stool and didn't say anything. Spoke first. I keep thinking about the room, she said. About standing up in front of all those people. She looked at the cup. I've been in rooms like that before. Not courtrooms, but rooms where everyone already knows what they think of you before you open your mouth. Where the question isn't whether they're judging you, but only what exactly they're judging you for. What do you do with it? He asked. When you're in a room like that. She thought about it honestly. I find that one thing I know better than anyone else in the room, she said. And I talk about that thing. Just that thing. If I can find it and stay with it, the other noise gets smaller. And tomorrow? Tomorrow the thing I know is that contract, she said. Clause. The mechanism. The pattern. She paused. I've read enough versions of it that I can see it the way you see a familiar road in bad weather. You don't need the markers anymore. You just know where it goes. He looked at her in the lamplight. She was tired, the sleepless nights had accumulated, and her face, the shadows under her eyes, the faint drawn quality around her mouth. But her hands were steady on the cup. You've been preparing for this for 13 years, he said, even when you didn't know it would be this specific room. She looked at him. That's a generous way to put it, she said. It's an accurate way to put it. She was quiet for a moment. I'm afraid of being dismissed, she said, and he could tell from the way she said it that it cost her something to say it plainly. Not argued with, not challenged. Dismissed. The way people dismiss things they've already decided not to take seriously. She looked at the range. I've had a lot of practice being dismissed. You won't be dismissed tomorrow, he said. You don't know that. No, he said. But I know that if anyone tries it, they'll have to do it in front of me. And everyone in that room knows what my opinion is worth in this valley. She looked at him. Something in her expression moved through several things in quick succession, something complicated that she didn't quite let resolve before she looked away. Get some sleep, she said. You too, he said. Neither of them moved for a while. Courthouse in Red Willow was the second largest building in town after the new hotel, and on the morning of the hearing, it was full. In a way, it rarely was not just the directly affected parties, but ranchers and merchants and townspeople who had heard enough about the creek diversion and the contract fraud to want to see how it went. Gideon arrived with Mara and Dale, and they made their way through a room that rearranged itself as they entered, conversations stopping and restarting, people shifting to watch. Harrow was already there. He was seated at the respondents' table with 2 attorneys. Gideon counted 2 and 3 associates, and he was dressed better than anyone else in the room, which Gideon suspected was deliberate. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who was managing a minor inconvenience. He glanced at Gideon when they came in and then let his gaze move to Mara, and something in his expression did a thing that was not quite a smile. Sloane was at the petitioner's table, with his organized stacks of documents and his slightly too large coat and his reading glasses already on, and he looked up when Gideon sat down beside him. Colorado documents came, Sloane said quietly. This morning. Certified copies. The language correlation is going to be very hard to argue away. Good, Gideon said. Harrow's lead attorney is a man named Calloway. I've appeared against him twice. He's smart and he's unpleasant, and he will attempt to make this about everything except the documents. Sloane looked at Mara, who had taken a seat to Gideon's left. Be ready for that. I'm ready, she said. The territorial hearing officer was a judge named Aldrich, who was somewhere between 55 and 70, had a face like old saddle leather, and clearly considered this proceeding one of several he would handle that week, rather than the defining event of anyone's life. He called the room to order with a single sharp knock, and proceeded with a brisk efficiency that suggested he had no patience for theater. The first hour was procedural. Sloane presented the Blackwell Senior Water Rights documentation, the certified Millbrook survey, and the creek diversion evidence that Dale had compiled with his careful measurements. Calloway, on behalf of Harrow, objected to the relevance of the historical survey on the grounds that modern territorial water management had superseded certain original grant terms. Sloane dismantled this without raising his voice, citing 3 territorial precedents in sequence, and then objected to the creek measurement methodology, which Aldrich overruled on the grounds that the measurements were clear and the objection was not. Harrow sat through all of it with the expression of a man watching weather he had already accounted for. Then Calloway stood up. He was a heavy-jowled man from Helena who wore his confidence like a second coat, and he spoke with the particular fluency of someone who understood that a courtroom was also a performance and that the audience in the gallery mattered as much as the judge. Your Honor, he said, we do not dispute the existence of the Blackwell water rights documentation. What we dispute is the characterization of our client's activities as fraudulent. He paused, letting the word fraudulent hang in the room so he could address it on his terms. What the petitioner is calling a scheme is, in fact, a legitimate water management proposal that Blackwell Ranch declined to participate in. The diversion structure on Silver Fork's eastern branch is a preliminary infrastructure installation connected to a management permit currently under review. Permit that has not been approved, Sloan said. Permit in process, Calloway corrected. The installations is on land where the petitioner holds senior water rights, Sloan said, and was constructed without any notification to or consent from the rights holder. Aldrich let them go for another few minutes, then held up one hand. Sloan, the Colorado documentation you mentioned in your filing. Yes, Your Honor. Sloan stood and carried the certified copies to the bench. These are certified records from the Colorado Territorial Land Office, establishing that a substantially identical contractual mechanism, the drought period subordination clause, was used by entities connected to the respondent in at least 3 Colorado land transactions between 1,871 and 1,878. In each case, the clause was invoked during drought conditions, resulting in water rights effectively transferring to the respondent's associated management companies. The room was not quiet exactly, but it changed register. Calloway was on his feet. Objection. The respondent's business activities in other territories are not relevant to this proceeding. They are precisely relevant, Sloan said, when they establish that the contractual mechanism under dispute is not an isolated term but a practiced instrument of. Gentlemen, Aldrich said. They stopped. Aldrich read through the Colorado documents for 4 minutes. Courtroom was very quiet. Harrow, for the first time since the hearing began, was not looking at the room. He was looking at his hands. Calloway recalibrated. He shifted his argument from the contract's legitimacy to the question of who had identified the problematic clause and what authority they carried. He did it smoothly, almost imperceptibly, but Gideon caught it, and he could see from the slight change in Mara's posture that she caught it too. The primary identification of this alleged clause mechanism, Calloway said, comes from an individual with no legal training, no professional credentials in land or water law, and a personal grievance against the respondent that predates her arrival in this territory by over a decade. He paused. The petitioner is asking this court to take seriously the legal analysis of a woman who works as a household cook and who has, by her own account, spent 13 years pursuing a personal vendetta against my client. Several people in the gallery shifted. Calloway wasn't finished. Furthermore, the nature of her relationship to the primary petitioner raises questions about the objectivity of mine, Your Honor. Sloan's voice cut through, clean and flat. The respondent's counsel is characterizing a witness's personal history and domestic employment as grounds to dismiss documented legal evidence. Colorado records are certified. The survey is certified. Clause is in the contract. The petitioner's household arrangements have no bearing on any of those facts. Aldrich looked at Calloway. Move on, counselor. Calloway moved on. But the damage he'd intended was already in the room hanging there. The suggestion of it, that Mara was compromised, personal, unqualified. Gideon could feel it the way you feel a shift in temperature. He could feel it landing on the ranchers in the gallery, the ones who'd signed the contracts, the ones who hadn't, the ones who were deciding in real time what they believed. He looked at Mara. She was looking at the floor in front of her with a controlled stillness that he recognized as the thing she did when something had hit and she was deciding what to do next. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they were completely steady. Then she looked up. She looked directly at Aldrich. And Aldrich, for whatever reason, the steadiness of it, maybe, or the fact that she was looking at him, when most people in her position would have looked away, said, Miss Ellison, you identified this clause. Yes, Your Honor. Explain what it does. Plain terms. Calloway started to stand. Aldrich looked at him. Calloway sat back down. Mara stood up. She walked to where the contract was laid out on Sloan's table. She was a large woman, and she moved the way she always moved, without apology, with the settled certainty of someone who had carried her body through a great many rooms and had long since stopped asking permission to stand somewhere. She picked up the contract and turned to the page 9 clause. This contract offers ranchers money and development capital in exchange for joining a water management cooperative, she said. The first 8 pages described the benefits. The money, the infrastructure, the collective bargaining on cattle markets. It reads well. It's meant to. She held up the page. Page 9 has a provision for drought periods. What it says, in the legal language, is that during any officially declared drought, the Cooperative Management Authority, which is Harrow's company, has the right to redistribute water access according to what it determines is regional necessity. She put her finger on the line. That phrase, regional necessity, has no definition in this contract. It's not defined anywhere in the document. It means whatever Harrow says it means. The room was listening, not politely listening, actually listening. The difference was audible. In Colorado, she said, 3 families signed contracts with this same clause. When the drought came, and in Colorado, droughts come, the management authority redistributed water. The families who'd signed found their cattle drinking last, if at all. 2 operations failed within a year. The third survived by selling half their herd at a loss. She set the contract down. My father was one of those 3. She looked at the ranchers in the gallery. Not at the judge, at the people. You're not bad businessmen for not catching this, she said. Clause is buried and the language is constructed. But it's there. And if this valley has a dry summer, and it will, because dry summers come, and if these contracts are valid, then one man controls your water. Not a cooperative. Not a regional authority. One man. The man who wrote the contracts. She paused. That's not water management. That's a mechanism for taking land without touching the deed. Silence. Clara Hendricks was in the 3rd row of the gallery, and she was looking at her hands. Then one of the Rourke brothers said, loud enough for the room to hear, that's what he told us, was regional benefit. Someone near the back said, I signed in October. Calloway was on his feet. Your Honor, this is not the appropriate forum for. Sit down, Counselor, Aldrich said. He said it the way a man says something he only intends to say once. Calloway sat. Aldrich looked at the Colorado documents again, then at the contract, then at Harrow. Harrow was looking at Mara with an expression that had finally abandoned the composed confidence of the past several hours. What was underneath it was harder and colder and more honest. She looked back at him. She didn't look away, Mr. Calloway, Aldrich said. I'm going to ask you a direct question. The management authority designated in this contract who controls it? Pause. My client holds a majority interest, so your client controls it. In partnership with majority interest means he controls it, Aldrich said. Yes or no? Another pause. In practice, yes, Aldrich made a note. I'm freezing the diversion permit, pending full investigation. Creek diversion structure is to be removed within 48 hours. He looked at Sloan. File the Colorado precedent documentation formally, and I'll review the signed contracts in that context. If the pattern holds, we'll be looking at fraud, not aggressive contracting. He knocked once. The room exhaled. Gideon stood and looked at Mara, who was still standing near the table, one hand resting on the contract she'd just dismantled in front of the room that had been trying to dismiss her for 3 weeks. She looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy, not with relief exactly, but with the strange disorientation that comes after you've been carrying something so long you've forgotten what it feels like not to. He came to stand beside her. You all right? He said. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That's fair. She looked at the room, which was moving now, people talking, Sloan being approached by 2 ranchers with questions, Harrow and Calloway in close conversation near the far wall. Harrow was using the kind of controlled, quiet gestures that meant the conversation was about damage control. He's not done, she said. No, Gideon agreed, but he's smaller than he was an hour ago. She looked at Harrow for one more moment. Then she looked at Gideon, and something in her expression was different from anything he'd seen on her face before. Not victory, not relief, but something quieter and more personal. The expression of a person who has carried something for a very long time and has just, in some essential way, been believed. You said something to me, she said, weeks ago, the morning after I told you about my father and the contract. He waited. You didn't ask me to prove it first, she said. You looked at the contract and you said, I won't sign it, without asking for documentation, without needing me to justify it. She paused. I've been thinking about that, and, he said. She held his gaze. Her voice was even, careful, the way she was when something mattered enough to say it correctly. I believed you before I knew you could be trusted, she said. The same way you believed me before you knew I could prove it. The room moved around them. Sloan was shaking hands with Pruitt. Dale was near the back, talking to the Rourke brothers. The winter light was coming through the courthouse windows at a low angle, pale and clear. Gideon looked at Mara Ellison, who had walked into his failing kitchen 6 weeks ago, with mud on her hem and a look in her eye that said she didn't need his permission to take up space. And he understood clearly, and without any remaining ambiguity, what it was he wanted to say. He said part of it. "I believed you before I knew you could prove it," he said. "And I'd believe you again." She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "We should help Sloan with the ranchers." "Yes," he said. "And someone needs to make sure the diversion order is documented before Harrow's people do anything with the structure." "Dale's already on it," he said. "Of course he is." She almost smiled. "Not quite." "All right then." She walked toward Sloan and the gathering ranchers, and Gideon watched her cross the room, large, direct, unhurried, carrying herself the way she always did, the way she'd decided to carry herself a long time ago, when she was 17 years old and standing in a different room, learning a different and harder kind of lesson. The room parted slightly as she moved through it. Not much, just enough to notice. Outside the courthouse, afterward, the cold air hit clean and sharp, and the sky over Red Willow was the particular blue that comes in Montana in winter when the storm has passed and the air is scoured clear. Gideon stood on the courthouse steps and watched the street and felt something that he hadn't been able to name for weeks finally settle into a shape he could hold. Sloan came out behind him. "Colorado will cooperate with a formal investigation," Sloan said, tucking his scarf tighter. "I'll have filings done by end of week. The 3 families, the ones who lost their land there, may be grounds for restitution." He paused. Mara's documentation was central to that. "I know," Gideon said. "She's been building that case for 13 years, Sloan said. "In her own way, with no legal standing and no support and no guarantee it would ever matter." He put his glasses in his pocket. "It's not something most people would do." "She's not most people," Gideon said. Sloan looked at him for a moment with the expression of a perceptive man who was choosing to move past what he was seeing. "No," he said. "She isn't." He picked up his case. "I'll be in touch." He went down the steps, and Gideon stood in the cold and watched the town move around him and thought about what came next, and what he wanted it to be, and how to say the rest of what he hadn't yet said in a way that was true and plain and didn't ask her to be anything other than exactly who she was. He thought he might know how. He wasn't certain yet, but he was getting there. The diversion structure came down in 41 hours. Dale supervised it himself, riding out to the creek before sunrise, the morning after the hearing with 2 of the ranch hands and a written order from Aldrich's court, and by midday the eastern branch of Silver Fork was running its natural course again, cutting through the frozen ground the way it had for longer than anyone in the valley had been alive. He came back to the ranch with mud on his boots and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done a concrete thing that needed doing, and he told Gideon it was done the way he reported most things, plainly, without decoration. "Water's running clean," he said. "No damage to the channel that won't correct itself by spring." "Good," Gideon said. Dale looked at him for a moment. Harrow's men didn't interfere. They knew better. "They looked like they wanted to," Dale said. "But they knew better." He hung up his coat. Done. It was done, that part of it anyway. What followed the hearing was not a clean resolution. It never was when the law was involved. It was a process, which meant it was slow and procedural and happened mostly in offices and through correspondence, while the valley went about its winter business. And the people who had been most affected waited to find out what their patience was worth. Sloan filed the formal fraud documentation within the week, as promised. The Colorado records arrived complete, certified, and more damning than even he had expected. There were not 3 families affected by Harrow's drought clause mechanism, but 7, spread across 2 Colorado counties, spanning 12 years. 3 had lost their land outright. 2 had survived by buying out their own contracts at prices that amounted to a quiet kind of robbery. The remaining 2 had fought through the territorial system for years, partially successfully, and their records contained correspondence that named Harrow's intermediary companies so specifically that the connection to the Montana operation was not an inference but a documented line. Sloan spread these findings across his desk in a meeting with Gideon and Mara in late December, and he laid them out with the careful, somewhat exhausted thoroughness of a man who had been working without stopping and had found more than he'd expected to find. The territorial prosecutor in Helena has opened an investigation, he said. That's not a guarantee of prosecution, but it means this is no longer a civil water dispute. Criminal inquiry. He looked at his papers. Harrow's Helena office has been closed. His associates are not returning correspondence. These are signs of a man who understands what is coming and is deciding how far in front of it he can get. Will he run? Gideon asked. He may try to manage the exposure, Sloan said. Settle some claims quietly. Position the Colorado losses as business disputes rather than fraud. He has resources, and he has attorneys, and he has experience with how slowly these investigations move. He paused. But he has something now that he didn't have before Thursday. He has a documented pattern across 2 territories, and he has the record of what happened in that courtroom. Judges talk to each other. Prosecutors talk to each other. He looked at Mara. And you gave them something they can follow. Mara was sitting with her hands folded on the table, composed and still, the way she'd been since the hearing, not deflated, not triumphant, but carrying a kind of internal quiet that Gideon had been watching and trying to understand. The families in Colorado, she said, the ones who lost their land. The restitution question is complicated, Sloan said. Land that transferred years ago through legal process, even fraudulent process, is difficult to recover. But financial restitution damages is a different argument, and with the documentation we now have, it's a serious one. He paused. It will take time. It's taken 13 years already, she said. More time is manageable. Sloan nodded. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who understood what those words actually contained and chose not to say so. There's something else, he said. He pulled a separate document from his stack. Your father's original Colorado homestead. The property transferred to a landholding company in 1876. That company dissolved in 1881. The land subsequently passed through 2 more transfers and currently sits with a ranching family named Whitmore, who purchased it legitimately in 1883 and have been working it since. He set the paper down. You cannot recover the land, but the fraud that caused the original transfer means your father's estate, you, as his heir, has a claim against Harrow's holdings. Not for the land itself, for its value at time of transfer, plus accrued damages. The room was quiet. Mara looked at the document. She didn't pick it up. How much? She said. Sloan told her. She was still for a moment. Then she said, that's a significant amount. It's what the land was worth, Sloan said, and what was taken. She looked at the number for a long time. Gideon watched her face. He'd gotten better at reading it over the past 2 months, the small movements that most people would have missed, because she'd spent so many years keeping her face neutral in rooms where showing something meant giving someone else a target. He could see the number landing. He could see it going through her and hitting something she hadn't fully prepared herself to feel. I need to think about that, she said. Take your time, Sloan said. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair and stood. Thank you, Everett, she said. She used his first name naturally, the way she'd started doing somewhere in the middle of all of this, when the formality between them had worn down to something more honest. She went out, and the door closed, and Sloan looked at Gideon. That's not nothing, Sloan said. What she's holding right now. I know, Gideon said. Give her time with it, I intend to. He found her an hour later, not in the kitchen, and not at the work table, but in the east wing, standing in the hallway outside one of the rooms he hadn't opened in 7 years. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there with her coat still on, looking at the closed door. He stopped beside her. She said, without looking at him, I used to imagine what it would feel like. When it was over, when it was finally moved, I thought I would feel lighter. She paused. Feel strange. Strange how? Like I've been walking toward something for so long that stopping feels like losing my balance. She turned to look at him. Is that ridiculous? No, he said. It's what happens when the thing you've been pointing yourself at stops being in front of you. She looked at the closed door again. What's in there? My mother's sitting room, he said. She didn't say anything. I haven't been able to go in, he said. 7 years. Keep telling myself I'll get around to it. He paused. I think I've been afraid that if I go in, something becomes final that I'm not ready for. She looked at him. Does it help that it's still there? He thought about that honestly. No, he said. It just stays unfinished. She reached out and put her hand on the door handle. She looked at him. A question. He nodded. She opened the door. The room was dusty and cold, and exactly as his mother had left it, the small upholstered chair by the window, the needlework basket on the side table, the faded curtains, the books arranged by some system only she had known. It smelled like closed space and old fabric and something underneath that he couldn't name but that he recognized. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. Mara came to stand beside him. "Took care of things," Mara said. "It wasn't a question. Every room in this house," he said. "Every person in it." He paused. "I don't think I understood when she was alive how much work that was." "People rarely do," Mara said. "The work that holds things together is invisible until it stops." He looked at the needlework basket. His mother had been working on something the year she died. He'd never looked at what it was. He crossed the room and picked up the top piece. It was half finished, a pattern of small wildflowers in yellow and blue, the needle still threaded and stored in the fabric the way she always stored it. He held it. Then he set it down carefully and looked at the room for another moment and said, "All right." It wasn't resolution. It wasn't the clean letting go that people talked about. It was just acknowledgement. The room existed. His mother had lived in it. Those things were both true, and both could be held at once, without one of them having to disappear. Mara understood that. He could tell she understood it without his having to say so. They went back to the kitchen, and she made coffee, and they sat at the counter the way they'd been sitting at the counter for 2 months, and didn't talk about the room, and didn't need to. He said, "What will you do with the money?" She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've been thinking about that since Sloane told me." She paused. The ranchers who signed Harrow's contracts, Clara Hendricks, the Rourkes, the others, they did it because they couldn't read what they were signing. Not because they were foolish, because the language was built to be unreadable unless you knew what to look for. She paused again. "And they're not the only ones. Every season there are homesteaders, widows, immigrant families, small ranchers who sign things they don't understand because they don't have access to someone who can explain it. Because attorneys cost money they don't have." Gideon looked at her. "I want to set something up," she said. "Something that gives people access to a legal review before they sign. Not complicated, not a law firm. Just a resource. Someone who knows what to look for and can explain it plainly." She looked at her coffee. "I could hire 2 or 3 people who know land and water law. Sloane could consult. We could be based in Red Willow and serve the surrounding territory. That will cost more than the restitution," he said. "Probably," she said. "But it doesn't have to be permanent expenditure. Structured correctly." She stopped herself. "You're going to tell me I'm already planning the next thing." "I'm going to say that I'm not surprised," he said. She almost smiled. "Not quite. My father's land bought his ruin," she said. "I'd rather it buy someone else's protection." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'll contribute to it." She looked at him sharply. "Blackwell Ranch has water rights that this valley depends on," he said. "It's not unrelated to my interests that the people in this valley can read a contract before they sign away those rights." "That's a practical argument," she said. "It's a true one," he said. "It's also not the only reason." She held his gaze. She was doing the thing she did when she was deciding whether to say what she was actually thinking, the slight tension at the corner of her mouth, the stillness that meant her mind was moving even when the rest of her wasn't. She said, "You've been doing that more." "Doing what?" "Saying part of something and stopping," she said. "You're not a man who usually stops in the middle of what he's saying." He looked at his coffee cup. "No," he said, "I'm not." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the winter evening was settling over the ranch, the sound of the hands coming in from the last of the day's work, horses in the barn, the creak of cold wood in the walls. Sounds he'd lived with for years. Sounds that had been, for most of those years, evidence of everything he had and nothing of what was missing. He said, "I don't need a cook anymore." She went very still. "Mrs. Pauley is managing the kitchen better than she has in years, because someone reorganized it so she doesn't have to cross the yard in the cold for the things she uses most," he said. "The household accounts are straight. The kitchen garden will come back in the spring. The chicken coop is fixed. The drainage problem by the barn foundation has been addressed. The ranch hands eat well, and they don't linger in the bunkhouse the way they used to because they'd rather be in the kitchen." He paused. "Everything you came here to do has been done." Her voice was careful. "Then you're saying—" "I'm saying I don't want to employ you," he said. "I haven't wanted to employ you for some time." He looked at her directly. "I want to marry you." The words sat in the room. She looked at him. He could see her working through it, not the decision. He didn't think, but the reality of it, the fact of it, the unexpected shape of standing in a kitchen in Montana, being asked this by this particular man. You could marry almost any woman in this territory, she said. Her voice was even. She was being careful. I know that, he said. I don't want almost any woman. I'm not easy, she said. I'm loud when I think something needs saying. I'll argue with you about the accounts. I'll reorganize things without asking. I'll take on things like the legal fund, and they'll cost money and time, and I won't apologize for them. I know all of that, he said. I'm not. She paused, and he could see what she was about to say and what it cost her to say it plainly. I'm not what people expect when they look at me and then look at what you have. They'll always have something to say about it. People have been having something to say about it since the day you drove into this yard, he said. It hasn't changed what I see. She held his gaze for a long moment. What do you see? She said. He thought about how to say it correctly. Not beautifully, he wasn't a man who spoke beautifully, and she wouldn't have trusted it if he tried. Just correctly. I see the woman who walked into a dying kitchen and told me the truth about it, he said. Who noticed a stone in my horse's hoof, and the drainage problem by the barn, and the drainage problem in Harrow's contract. Who rode 40 miles in a blizzard and grabbed a horse on an icy slope and stood up in a room full of people who'd been trying to dismiss her for weeks and explained, plain as daylight, exactly what had been done to them. He paused. Who opened a door I hadn't been able to open in 7 years and just stood there with me. He stopped. I have 6,800 acres and a house with 14 rooms and more cattle than I can easily count. I have enough of everything a man is supposed to want. He looked at her steadily. You're the only thing in any of it that makes me want to come home. The room was very quiet. Mara looked at him for a long time. Her hands were still on the coffee cup. Her eyes were bright in a way that she would not. He suspected, permit to go further than that, she was too controlled, too practiced at deciding not to let things out. But he could see it. That's not a small thing to say, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. Another silence. And she said, I haven't let myself want something like this in a long time. Her voice was lower than usual. I got careful. After my father's land, after all the moving and the rooms where people decided what I was before I spoke, I got very careful about what I let myself want. Because wanting something and losing it is harder than not wanting it in the first place. I know, he said. I'm telling you that so you understand, she said. That it's not nothing, what you're asking. I know what I'm asking, he said. She looked at him for one more long moment. Yes, she said. He exhaled. He hadn't been aware he was holding anything until he let it go. Yes, she said again. And this time there was something in it that was not careful at all. They were married in February, on a day when the temperature had climbed enough that the snow was soft and the yard wasn't frozen solid, which was the best Montana winter could offer, and which Mara said was perfectly adequate. The ceremony was in the main room of Blackwell Ranch, which had been opened and lit and warmed in a way it hadn't been for years, the curtains pulled back, the fireplace going, the rooms that had sat empty and gray now, full of the particular noise and warmth of people who had chosen to be somewhere. Sloane came. The Hendricks widow Clara came with her 2 sons. Pruett came, and the Rourke brothers, and a dozen of the Valley families who had spent the fall being protected by something Mara had set in motion. Mrs. Pauley sat in the best chair near the fire and wept quietly, for reasons she did not explain, which Gideon suspected had to do with the particular relief of seeing a house come back to life after a long emptiness. The ranch hands stood along the back wall in their good shirts, cord included, who had spent 3 days beforehand being particular about the state of his collar, in a way that Dale had found both touching and exhausting. It was not a large wedding. It was not a polished one. Someone forgot to tell the cook Mara, who had made half the food herself the day before, that the cobbler was supposed to be served warm, and it came out at room temperature, and she ate a piece herself and said it was fine, and it was fine. Pruitt's horse got into the yard during the ceremony and had to be redirected by cord, which caused a disturbance. Curtains in the east parlor turned out to need replacing more urgently than anyone had noticed, and one of them came down during the afternoon, which caused a different kind of disturbance. None of it mattered. What mattered was that the house sounded the way Gideon had forgotten. A house could sound not just occupied, but inhabited, with all the noise and difficulty and imperfect warmth that the word actually means. The Frontierland Defense Fund opened its doors in Red Willow the following April, in a two-room office above the same boot repair shop where Sloan had his practice. Maras had spent the winter building it, hiring a young attorney named Marsh, who had recently passed the territorial bar and needed work, contracting Sloan for monthly consultations, establishing a fee structure that scaled with what people could pay and went to nothing for those who couldn't. In its first 3 months, the fund reviewed 41 contracts for Valley residents, caught 11 problematic clauses. 2 of those clauses, on examination, turned out to be Harrow-connected instruments that had continued circulating after his operation officially closed, signed under different company names, the same mechanism underneath. Word spread the way word spread in a territory slowly, then suddenly. By summer, people were riding in from 2 counties away. Harrow's prosecution moved through the territorial system with the grinding slowness that legal processes reserved for complicated cases, which this one certainly was. His attorneys worked hard, and his resources delayed things. Sloan was patient, and the Colorado documentation was not going away. And in the end, 2 years after the hearing in Red Willow Courthouse, Victor Harrow was convicted of fraudulent inducement in land contracts across 2 territories and sentenced to prison and substantial financial penalties. The restitution to the Colorado families took longer still. Some of it came through. Some of it came through partially. The law is what it is. It can be used as a tool against the people it was meant to protect, and it can also, given enough evidence and enough patience, and enough people willing to stand in a room and say the plain truth plainly, be used as it was intended. Mara stood in Sloan's office the afternoon the Colorado verdict was filed and read the document twice, and then put it down on the desk and stood there without speaking for a while. Sloan waited. "My father never knew his land was worth fighting for," she said. "He thought it was just bad luck, bad timing, the way things go sometimes for people who don't have much." She paused. "It wasn't bad luck. Someone chose to take it." "Yes," Sloan said. "And someone else chose to stop it from happening again." She picked up the document and set it back in its place. "That matters." "The choosing," she looked at him. "Not the outcome. Choosing." He nodded. He understood what she meant, that the outcomes had been good, but they hadn't been guaranteed, and that Mara had made the choice to push at this thing before she knew it would move, back when it was still just a woman with a traveling bag and a folder of 13-year-old papers, and anger pointed in a useful direction. That was the actual story, when you stripped it down. Not that justice worked, because it worked slowly and incompletely and required being pushed, but that someone decided to push. Gideon was waiting outside with the wagon. She came down the steps, and he looked at her and read whatever he needed to read in her face without asking. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He helped her up. She didn't need help. She never needed help. But she let him offer it, and she took it briefly, the same way she'd done since February, which was its own kind of language. They drove back to the ranch through an April afternoon that smelled like mud and new grass, and the first tentative warmth of a season that was going to insist on itself, regardless of what winter thought about the matter. The ranch looked different from the road than it had 2 years ago. The kitchen garden was visible along the east side, legible from a distance now, ordered rows coming up green. The chicken coop had been repainted by Cord over the winter, his own initiative, an act of ownership over a small thing that had become his. The curtains in the east wing were new. The main room's fireplace had been cleaned and repointed and was used regularly. The house didn't look like a different place. It looked like the same place that had finally been told what it was for. That evening, Gideon came downstairs and found Mara in the kitchen. This was not unusual. She was almost always in the kitchen in the evenings, but the nature of her presence there had shifted over the 2 years of their marriage in a way that was hard to articulate but easy to feel. She wasn't managing the kitchen the way she'd managed it when she first arrived, with the focused competence of someone proving something. She was just in it, using it, making it do what she wanted, same as always, but without the particular invisible effort of a person who knows they might be asked to leave. She was arguing with Dale about the summer supply order. Dale was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the supply ledger, and he had the expression of a man who had been in this argument before and had not won it but came back anyway because he had professional self-respect. "The seed order is fine," he said. "The seed order doesn't account for the expansion of the West Garden," Mara said, without looking up from what she was doing at the range. "We need more than what you've listed. The West Garden was your idea." Then the seed order should reflect it. The budget. I wrote the budget, she said. I know what's in it. Dale looked at Gideon with the expression of a man seeking solidarity from another man. Gideon poured himself coffee and sat down at the counter. She's right about the seeds, he said. Dale closed the ledger. I know she is, he said. I just like to see if anything's changed. Mara made a sound that was mostly a laugh. Cord came through the back door with the particular clatter of a young man who had never learned to enter a room quietly, hat in his hand, cheeks red from being outside, and said there was something odd happening with the water level in the North Pond, and did anyone want to come look? They went. Gideon and Dale and Cord, and Mara put down what she was doing and came too. Because she always came when there was something to look at, and the pond turned out to be fine. A beaver had started working the inlet channel. Interesting, but not a problem, and they stood in the late afternoon, watching this small industrious animal go about its business, and Cord said something that made Dale snort, and the sound of it carried across the open water. On the way back, Mara walked beside Gideon. She was wearing her working coat, the better one she'd bought in the fall, and her dark hair was half out of its pins the way it always was by evening, and she had the mud of the pond bank on the hem of her dress. Beaver, she said. Beaver, he agreed. That inlet will need watching. I know. I'll put it in the ledger. I know you will, he said. She glanced at him sideways. You're smiling. I'm allowed. She made a quiet sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement, which was as close to being teased as she usually got, and they walked back to the ranch through the spring evening, and the kitchen light was already on because Mrs. Polly had gone in ahead of them, and the smoke was coming from the chimney, and the horses were in the barn. There is a thing that happens to people who spend a long time surviving, and survival is its own kind of skill. It's necessary and hard-won and not to be discounted, and it is this. They can forget that surviving was never meant to be the permanent condition. It was meant to be the bridge to something else. The hard crossing that gets you to the other side. Mara Ellison had been crossing for 13 years. Crossed. She was on the other side. And the other side turned out to be a kitchen in Montana, with a husband who noticed when she was carrying something without asking her to put it down, and a legal fund that had so far caught 11 fraudulent clauses and would catch more, and a kitchen garden that was going to need more seed than Dale had ordered, and a beaver in the North Pond inlet that needed watching, and a young ranch hand who had learned to care about chickens, and an old housekeeper in the best chair by the fire, and a house with 14 rooms, most of which were now open. It wasn't a perfect life. It was an honest one. That, she had learned, was the rarer and better thing, not the life that goes smoothly, not the story that resolves without cost, but the life built from the choices you made on the days when you didn't know how it would turn out. The days you got on a horse in a blizzard anyway. The days you stood up in the room anyway. The days you let yourself want something anyway, knowing that wanting and losing was a risk, and deciding the wanting was worth it. She'd decided. She'd been deciding for a long time, in her own way, which was the only way she'd ever done anything. Years later, people in Red Willow would tell newcomers about Mara Blackwell, about the legal fund, about the hearing, about the creek. They'd mention the Harrow case the way a valley mentions the flood that defined its landscape, not with drama, but with the matter-of-fact weight of something that actually happened and actually changed things. They called her the heart of Blackwell Ranch. She found the phrase mildly sentimental, which she mentioned to Gideon one evening when he told her he'd heard it in town. It's accurate, he said. It's generous, she said. Those aren't different things, he said. She considered this. Then she went back to the accounts she was reviewing, and Gideon stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at his wife flour on her apron, ink on her hand, dark hair coming down, the lamp making the room warm and yellow around her, and thought about the evening he'd stood in this same doorway and heard his ranch hands laugh for the first time in years, and hadn't known yet what that meant, or what she was, or what was coming. He knew now. He went in and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at the counter beside her without a word. She picked it up without looking away from the ledger. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, pressing in from the mountains, cold and enormous and indifferent to any particular human life. Inside the kitchen, the lamp burned steady, and the fire was going, and someone who had been surviving for a very long time was home. Gideon sat down at the counter beside her and drank his coffee and looked at the ledger she was working through. And after a while he said, "You're reviewing the fund accounts." The spring quarter, she said. Marsh sent them over this morning. How does it look? She turned a page. Better than last quarter. The fee structure is working. The sliding scale means we're covering operating costs from the people who can pay, which means we can take the cases from people who can't without losing ground. She paused. There's a family from up near the Clearwater immigrants. Been here 4 years. Filed a homestead claim in good faith. Someone came through last month with a competing claim document that looks legitimate on the surface. She put her finger on the entry. It isn't. Marsh spotted it in 2 hours. The original filing has a survey reference that doesn't match any actual survey on record. Whoever drew it up was counting on the family not knowing how to check. And now they know, Gideon said. And now they know, she said. And they keep their land. He looked at the entry. A family he'd never met on land he'd never seen, keeping something they'd worked for because a woman in Red Willow had built a fund that could send a young attorney to look at a document for 2 hours. There were 11 entries in the spring quarter. 11 families who'd come through the door above the boot repair shop with papers they didn't understand and left with someone having looked at those papers carefully. That was the work. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that made speeches at. Just the daily repetition of making sure the next person didn't lose what Mara's father had lost. He said, Marsh is good. He's getting better, she said. Came in thinking the law was mostly about argument. He's learning it's mostly about reading. She turned another page. I'm going to hire a second person in the fall. A woman, if I can find one with the right background. There are families who come in and won't talk freely in front of a man they don't know. We're losing cases. We don't even know we're losing because people leave before they say what they came to say. Gideon looked at her sideways. You've already found someone, he said. She didn't quite smile. There's a woman in Helena who studied law informally under a retired territorial judge. Can't be admitted to the bar because of current practice rules, but she can review documents and consult and explain. A pause. She reminds me a little of how I was at 25, capable and furious about the cap on it. Hire her, he said. I intend to. She closed the ledger. I'm telling you because it affects the fund budget, and the fund budget is your money too. It's our money, he said. She looked at him. It still did something to her when he said that the easy naturalness of it, the absence of any version of a reminder that the ranch was his, and the contribution was his, and the generosity was therefore his. He said, Sir R. the way he said everything that was true, plainly, without looking for acknowledgement. Our money, she said. Correct, he said. She picked up her coffee. He watched the lamp flame move slightly in a draft from the window and thought about something he'd been thinking about for several weeks, which was the East Wing. He'd been going in there. Not every day, and not for long, but regularly enough that it no longer required a decision. He'd sorted through his mother's sitting room in January, slowly, over several Sunday afternoons, while Mara was at the fund office and the house was quiet. He hadn't thrown much away. He'd found the unfinished needlework and looked at it for a long time, and then put it in the cedar chest with the other things she'd made, where it could exist without being a wound. The room was being used now. Mara worked in there on mornings when she needed quiet, and the kitchen was busy. She'd set up a small writing desk near the window, his mother's chair pulled up to it, and there was something about seeing the room with someone in it that had settled something he hadn't known was unsettled. I want to do something with the spare room, he said. Mara looked at him. Which one? The one at the south end of the upstairs hall. The one that's been used for storage since before I can remember. She waited. I'd like to clear it out, he said. Fix it up properly. She was still looking at him. She had the expression of someone who understood what was being said beneath the words and was deciding how to respond to that instead of the words. How long have you been thinking about this? She said. A few weeks. And you're sure? Yes, he said. I'm sure. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she set down her coffee. I'll need to measure it, she said. Tomorrow, he said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee again and went back to something else. The way she moved through decisions made them, moved on, trusted them without circling back. He loved that about her, among many other things. The absence of drama around the things that mattered most. The room was cleared and refitted over the spring, which was a larger undertaking than either of them had estimated, because it turned out the floor needed re-leveling, and 2 of the window frames were warped, and the whole thing took longer than planned and cost more than budgeted, which caused a brief argument between Mara and the carpenter that Gideon stayed well clear of. The carpenter lost, which surprised no one. In September of that year, Mara gave birth to a daughter. It was a hard labor longer than expected, harder than the doctor had prepared them for. And there were several hours in the night when Gideon sat outside the door and felt the particular helplessness of a man who can manage any practical crisis, except the one happening just beyond a closed door. Mrs. Polly sat beside him for part of it. She didn't say anything useful and didn't try to. She just sat there, which was what the situation required. The child arrived before dawn, announced by a sound that was small and furious and entirely itself. Gideon was allowed in. Mara was exhausted in a way he had never seen her. She was always moving, always forward-facing, always with something left in reserve, and seeing her still and pale and hollowed by what the night had taken from her was a different kind of knowing her. She had the baby against her chest, and she was looking at the child with an expression he'd never seen on her face before because she'd never had cause for it. It wasn't soft, exactly. It was the opposite of her usual guardedness, the same intensity she brought to everything, but directed somewhere completely undefended. He sat on the edge of the bed. She looked up at him. "She looks like she has opinions," Mara said. Her voice was rough. "Comes by it honestly," he said. Something moved across Mara's face. Not a laugh, she didn't have the energy for a laugh, but the thing that comes before one. "I want to call her Ruth," Mara said. "If that's all right." "Ruth," he said. "My mother's name," she said. "She died when I was 9. I barely remember her." She looked at the baby. "But I remember she stopped. She was not a small person, in the way that matters. She was present, even in the little I remember." "Ruth," he said again. "Yes." Ruth Blackwell turned out to have as advertised opinions. She had them about food, about bedtime, about the chickens which she adored past all reason, about Cord, who became her devoted, if slightly baffled protector, about horses which she wanted to ride before she could reliably walk, about the kitchen, which she treated from earliest mobility as her personal domain. She had her mother's brown eyes and her father's jaw, and a combination of their respective stubbornnesses that Dale said privately to his wife was going to be something to witness when it fully developed, which his wife found funny and accurate. Mara took Ruth to the fund office from the time she was 4 months old, first in a basket, then in a carrier, then toddling around the 2 rooms while Marsh reviewed documents, and the Helena woman, her name was Vera, sharp as a new file. Exactly what Mara had said, she was explained contracts to families across the long table. Ruth learned to sit quietly when people were talking about serious things. She also learned, by the time she was 3, to identify the general shape of a land contract, because they were the most common piece of paper in the office, and she'd grown up watching her mother look at them. "This one has a lot of pages," she told a rancher once, while he was waiting for his appointment, pointing at the contract in his hand with the authority of a very small person who had formed a view. The rancher looked at Mara. "She's right to be suspicious of length," Mara said, without looking up from what she was reading. "Long contracts either have a lot to offer or a lot to hide. Sit down and Vera will be with you shortly." The rancher sat down, and Ruth went back to whatever she'd been doing. And Mara heard Vera in the back room making a sound that she was successfully suppressing into professional neutrality and not quite achieving. She had been growing a thing that outlasted the original fight. That was the part she hadn't fully planned for. She'd planned for the fight, for the case, for the fund's establishment. She hadn't planned for what it would become once it was running and the fight was done, how it would keep growing in directions she hadn't mapped. New staff, new counties, correspondence from territorial attorneys in 3 other states who'd heard about the drought clause pattern and wanted the documentation. An invitation to present findings to a Helena land law symposium, which she accepted and delivered with Ruth on her hip for part of it because the child had been unwell, and Mara was not going to cancel the presentation. The men at the symposium did not know what to do with this, which Mara found mildly entertaining. Sloane attended and said it was the best presentation of the morning, and also that the child had seemed attentive, which Mara doubted but appreciated. Gideon rode into Red Willow one afternoon in the fall, when Ruth was 5, and stopped at the fund office to collect Mara, who had said she'd be done by 3 and was not done by 3 because she was never done by 3 when there was work in front of her. He came upstairs, and she was at the long table with a family husband-wife, 2 adult sons, all 4 of them with the careful stillness of people who had come somewhere unfamiliar to ask for help with something important. Mara had the contract spread on the table and was pointing at something and talking, and none of the 4 people were looking at the contract. They were looking at her, not the way people had looked at her when she first came to Red Willow, not with the particular assessment that reduced her to her body and her size and their own preconceptions. They were looking at her the way people look at someone who is telling them something that matters and that they can trust. Gideon stood in the doorway and watched. Ruth was on the floor in the corner, doing something with a piece of string and 2 buttons that had occupied her completely for the past 20 minutes, as Gideon understood it. After a while, Mara looked up and saw him. 3 o'clock, he said. The aldermans came in at 2:30, she said. I'm nearly done. He nodded and leaned against the doorframe. She went back to explaining. She was thorough and she was plain, and she watched the family's faces to see where understanding landed and where it didn't, and when it didn't, she found a different route to the same place. The same patience she'd had in the courtroom years ago, and that she'd been applying ever since. She had learned, over the years of the fund, that the moment a person genuinely understood what had been in the contract they'd almost signed was never a dramatic moment. It was usually quiet. It usually looked like relief. The way relief actually looks, not joy, but the particular release of tension that has been held so long it became invisible. The Alderman family had that moment over the table. Father said quietly, "We nearly signed this." "I know," Mara said. "But you didn't. We didn't know what to look for." "That's what we're here for," she said. "Now you know. And now you have a copy of the annotated version, which means if anyone presents you with something similar, you have a reference." She paused. "Come back if you see anything that doesn't look right." They left with the annotated copy and expressions of a family that had walked in scared and was walking out steadier. Gideon picked Ruth up from the floor. She immediately tried to show him the string and button project, which he examined with appropriate gravity, and Mara put on her coat. "Good day?" he asked. The aldermans nearly signed a mineral rights extraction contract with a subordination clause that would have let the extracting company access and damage surface land without compensation, she said. "We caught it." "So yes," he said. She considered. "Yes," she said. They went down the stairs together and out into the fall afternoon, Red Willow doing its end-of-season business around them, the street full of wagons, and people making the particular preparations of a town, getting ready for another Montana winter. 2 women passed on the boardwalk and nodded, not the careful nod of people managing social obligations, but the easy nod of people acknowledging someone they knew and thought well of. Mara nodded back. Gideon noticed and said nothing because she would have told him he was reading too much into a nod, which was possibly true, but also possibly not. He helped Ruth onto the wagon seat she was capable of getting up herself and insisted on demonstrating this most of the time, but occasionally permitted assistance, depending on her mood, and Mara climbed up on the other side, and they drove out of Red Willow toward the ranch, the same road they'd driven together 100 times now, through every season, the mountains always doing something different in the light. Ruth fell asleep against Mara's side about 3 miles out, which was a thing she did on wagon rides with the complete efficiency of a child who knew when a situation permitted rest and took it. Mara adjusted the child's weight slightly and kept her arm around her and looked at the road. Gideon looked at the 2 of them. He thought about a man who had lived 7 years in a house, full of rooms he'd closed off, eating supper, standing at the counter, letting the kitchen garden die, letting the fireplace go cold, going through the motions of a life that was large in acres and empty in almost every other way that mattered. He thought about a morning in November when his foreman had brought a woman to his yard who looked at his house and told him it was dying around him and was right. The things that change a life are not always the things that look like changes from the outside. Sometimes they arrive in a wagon, carrying 2 bags, wearing a mended gray dress, looking at you with brown eyes that have already measured exactly what kind of man you are and are waiting to see if you'll prove them right or wrong. He tried to prove them right. He was still trying. He thought that was probably how it worked. In the end, not that you arrived somewhere and the work was done, but that you kept choosing, day by day, to be the person the people you loved believed you could be. Mara was looking at the road with the quiet, settled expression she'd been growing into over the years, the one that had replaced the guarded watchfulness of her first months at the ranch. Not soft, she would never be soft, and he'd never wanted her to be. Settled, belonging to a place and a life, the way a person belongs when they've stopped waiting to be asked to leave. Ruth breathed slowly against her side. The ranch came into view around the last bend the house. The barn, the kitchen garden, the smoke from the chimney, because Mrs. Polly had gone in ahead and started the range, which she always did, moving slowly and carefully, and with the deliberateness of a woman who understood that the small acts of daily care were not small. Gideon pulled the wagon up to the front and tied the horses. Mara transferred Ruth, still sleeping. To his arms the child shifted, made a sound, didn't wake, and climbed down and went up the steps to hold the door. He carried his daughter through the door of his house. Kitchen was warm. The lamp was lit, Mrs. Polly had left something on the range, and it smelled the way the house always smelled now, like food being made, and a fire being kept, and the particular combination of things that means a place is being lived in fully, not just occupied. Gideon settled Ruth on the small cot they kept in the corner of the kitchen for exactly this purpose for afternoons, when she came home from town already asleep and needed somewhere to finish it, and covered her with the quilt his mother had made, which had come out of the cedar chest and back into use, which felt right. Mara was at the range. She was already looking at something on the counter, already thinking about supper, already 3 steps ahead of the present moment, the way she always was. He came to stand behind her. He didn't say anything. She reached back without looking and found his hand and held it for a moment, just that, and then let it go and went back to what she was doing. Outside, the Montana evening came down off the mountains the way it always did, cold and clear and enormous. Inside, the kitchen held.